Imagine a story so old it slips between the cracks of myth and memory, a story whispered in clay tablets that survived fire, flood, and time itself. It begins not with the rise of kings or the carving of monuments, but with the possibility that humanity was not born alone, that our origins may be tied to visitors who came from beyond the sky. These beings, remembered in Sumerian myths as the Anunnaki, are described not as gods in the sense of divinity, but as rulers and architects, figures who shaped rivers, raised cities, and perhaps even molded human life itself. Some call this speculation. Others see it as a forgotten chapter of history, deliberately buried because it unsettles the neat order of civilization's timeline. Yet when we follow the fragments, stories of great floods, towers reaching the heavens, and cities reduced to dust by weapons of fire, the lines between fable and record blur. What remains is a haunting possibility, that our past holds secrets far stranger than we dare imagine, and that the world we walk upon is built atop the ruins of an age erased. This is where our journey begins. Welcome to historic sleep. If you're drawn to stories like these, the ones that live in the shadows between what we see and what was made to disappear, feel free to like and subscribe only if it feels right, and let me know in the comments where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now. I love seeing our little map of watchers light up around the world. The first images that emerge are not of Earth as we know it, but of another world adrift in the same solar embrace. The ancients called it Nibiru, a planet with an orbit so vast that one of its years stretched across many of ours, a wandering colossus circling the sun in an elongated path that carried it into the darkness of space before returning, centuries later, to brush past the familiar planets. In the tablets, Nibiru shines with a reddish glow, its skies filled with volcanic ash that painted every dawn crimson. It was not a tranquil paradise, but a world of ceaseless struggle. Continents scarred by war, mountains split by weapons of terrible force, seas shaken by tempests born of fractured skies. And within this world lived the ancestors of those the Sumerians would later call the Anunnaki. They were not yet gods of Earth. They were a people clawing for survival against the slow collapse of their own home. The story tells of two great factions, North and South, their rivalry stretching across millennia. Imagine warriors clad in glittering armor of unknown alloys, clashing in battles that lit the sky with fire until the planet itself seemed ready to tear apart. For thousands of years the conflict raged until exhaustion forced a truce. Out of that fragile peace, a union was forged. A warrior prince of the north, An, and a maiden of the south, Antu, were joined in marriage, binding two nations into one bloodline. From them descended the royal house that would shape the destiny of both Nibiru and Earth. Their son, Enki, was first to inherit the throne, but fate proved merciless. He left no heir, and so power shifted to his brother Anib, who changed the law of succession by marrying his half-sister, Ninib. From that moment forward, legitimacy was measured not merely by birth, but by blood that was doubled through sisterhood. The law of the seed, they called it, ensuring that only those born of a royal sister could inherit. It was a law that solved one crisis while sowing countless others. Rival claimants, half-brothers, and children born to concubines would all fight beneath this banner, spilling blood to defend or to challenge the rule of succession. One of those rulers, Anshargal, looked to the heavens and named the great circuit of Nibiru's orbit a shar, a measurement of time that became the heartbeat of their history. It was during his reign that disaster struck. Nibiru's atmosphere, the veil that kept its air breathable and its heat contained, began to fail. The breach widened year after year. The skies grew thinner, the winds harsher, the fields more barren. Kings rose and fell, but none could halt the slow death of their world. Some sought to reignite dormant volcanoes by launching missiles into their throats, hoping to thicken the skies with ash. The eruptions came, but the healing never followed. Others dreamed of dusting the heavens with powdered gold, a radiant shield that would preserve their fragile sky. But gold was scarce, and rebellion brewed when promises went unmet. From this turmoil came a figure who would change everything: Alalu, a prince who seized the throne in desperation, claiming descent from ancient kings, only to face challenge from another, Anu, heir of the rightful line. The two wrestled not only with words, but with bodies, locked in combat within the palace. Anu prevailed, and Alalu, broken and dishonored, fled the planet. His escape was not into exile alone, but into legend. In a celestial chariot he tore across the void, his course set for a small blue world on the inner side of the asteroid belt, a world he had glimpsed from afar and believed to hold the very element that could save his people. His journey reads like a cosmic odyssey, past the frozen shadow of Pluto, then through the orbits of Neptune and Uranus, skimming the skies of Saturn with its golden rings, brushing by the red storms of Jupiter. And then the most perilous passage of all, the hammered bracelet, what we now know as the asteroid belt. Shards of shattered worlds hurtled in endless motion, colliding, spinning, threatening to obliterate anything that dared cross. Alalu cleared a path with weapons of fire, blasting rock after rock until at last he broke through. Beyond lay Mars, and finally Earth. When his chariot descended, the planet greeted him with waters that shimmered, mountains that pierced the sky, and an air that filled his lungs with strength. He drank, he bathed, he ate of the fruits and fish, and he knew this was no barren sphere. It was a jewel, and it held gold. The tablets describe Alalu's awe as he tested the rivers and found particles of the precious metal glimmering within. In that moment he grasped both triumph and bargaining power. He sent his message across the void to Anu and the Council of Nibiru. He had discovered the salvation of their world, but he would not surrender it freely. If they wished the gold, he demanded the crown. Imagine the shock on Nibiru as his voice crackled across the void, proof that he had survived the hammered bracelet and reached the forbidden blue world. The council hesitated, but the evidence of gold was undeniable. And so began the struggle that would forever bind Earth to the fate of the stars. Soon, another ship was dispatched. A son of Anu himself, Ea, later known as Enki, would come to verify Alalu's claim. He was no mere emissary. He was a master of knowledge, a prince with the skill of the engineer, a mind tuned to the mysteries of water, stone, and life itself. With 50 companions, he crossed the gulf, through dangers that had nearly destroyed Alalu, and came at last to the waters of Earth. There, on the shores of marsh and sea, Enki and Alalu embraced, allies for the moment, though rivals in the destiny to come. Together they tested the rivers, dredged the marshes, sifted the ocean depths. The gold was real, but not yet abundant enough. More would be needed, much more, hidden in the deeper veins of the earth. It was then that Enki, gazing out upon the forests and rivers, began to dream of something beyond simple mining. He envisioned settlements, cities rising from the wilderness, machines and temples, places where sky could meet soil in harmony. He named the first settlement Aridu, home in the faraway, and from there the saga of gods upon earth began. The first sparks of Aridu flickered against the vast wilderness like a fragile flame, and yet to the Anunnaki it was more than a camp. It was a statement. A circle of reed huts stood beside the waters, their walls hardened with clay, lit by fire that reflected in the eyes of men from the stars. From the landing place, Enki surveyed the marshlands and the wide-flowing rivers, and in his mind he traced lines where canals could be cut, fields drained, walls built. He walked barefoot through mud, scooping the soil with his hands, testing its strength as if he were already imagining foundations. To him, Earth wasn't a mere quarry of gold, but a living canvas, one that could be shaped into permanence. Alalu, however, saw the settlement differently. To him, Aridu was leverage, proof that he had led the way. He reminded Enki that it was his discovery, his risk, his victory. He repeated his demand for kingship. Enki, ever the pragmatist, urged patience. The gold in the rivers was promising, but insufficient. Their instruments detected richer veins hidden far beneath the southern lands, in places where the soil bled with shimmering dust when struck by stone. If Nibiru were to be saved, they needed more than particles. They needed mountains of treasure. News traveled slowly across the stars, but when Anu received word of Aridu and the samples brought by Enki, his heart hardened. He could not yield his throne to Alalu, no matter the discovery. Still, he ordered reinforcements. Another contingent was dispatched, commanded by his second son, Enlil. If Enki was the builder, Enlil was the commander, strict, disciplined, quick to anger, carrying the weight of authority in every stride. With him came warriors, sky chariots, and plans to carve not only settlements, but cities of order. Where Enki saw a world to nurture, Enlil saw a post to control. The tension between brothers began quietly, like the low growl of distant thunder. Enki had chosen the marshlands near the sea, where water and clay allowed him to fashion tools and test extraction. Enlil preferred the highlands, where the air was crisp and the cedar forests rose like pillars to the heavens. To Enlil, Earth was dangerous, a place to exploit swiftly and abandon. To Enki, Earth was potential incarnate, worthy of cultivation. When the two presented their visions to Anu upon his arrival, the king saw value in both. To decide their fates, he proposed a drawing of lots. One would remain ruler of Nibiru, one would command the Eden of the highlands, and one would oversee the waters and the distant Abzu, the land where gold veins waited. In the lot, Anu retained his throne. Enlil was given dominion over the Eden, and Enki was granted mastery of the Abzu and all the seas. It was then that he received the name that would echo through human memory: Enki, Lord of Earth. Alalu, stripped of claims, seethed with humiliation. He demanded recognition, argued that it was he who had found the planet, he who had risked the hammered bracelet. Anu silenced him with a challenge: a second combat. In the courtyard they fought, stripped of regalia, locked in a brutal grapple. The crowd of Anunnaki roared as dust and sweat filled the air. Anu triumphed again, pressing Alalu beneath his heel. Yet humiliation breeds vengeance. In one final act of fury, Alalu bit away the king's manhood, spitting blood and fate in a single motion. Chaos followed. Some demanded Alalu's execution, others pleaded for mercy. It was Enki who intervened, insisting the law be upheld. A council of 7 judges convened, and after heated debate, Alalu was condemned not to death but to exile, cast away upon the barren world of Lamu, what we know as Mars. There he would waste away, remembered in bitterness and legend. Anu departed Earth soon after, leaving his sons to their domains. Enki plunged into his work in the Abzu, overseeing surveys, building workshops, designing tools of extraction. He dreamed of rivers harnessed, stones carved, shafts dug deep into the earth to reach the veins of gold that glittered in darkness. Enlil, meanwhile, surveyed the Eden highlands, choosing a mountain valley where he ordered stones quarried and a landing platform raised, what future generations would know as Baalbek. The Anunnaki labored under his command, cutting cedars, erecting towers, laying the foundations of cities with names that would echo across time: Larsa, Lagash, Shurupak, and Nippur. The heroes of Nibiru, those who had left their home for this mission, were divided into 2 great companies. 600 remained upon Earth, digging, building, exploring. They became known as the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. 300 more were stationed on Lamu to guard the way and aid in the transfer of goods. They were called the Igigi, those who observe and see. Between Earth and their home stretched a chain of stations, skyports strung across the void, each one a stepping stone for the chariots carrying gold. It was a grand design, an empire of stone, sky, and starlight. Yet beneath the grandeur lay unrest. The work was brutal, the climate harsh, and the cycles of Earth wore upon bodies not designed for its rhythms. The Igigi grumbled in their watchposts, staring down at Earth with envy. The Anunnaki sweated in mines and forges, longing for the comforts of Nibiru. Even their rulers were not immune. Enlil brooded in his highlands, growing ever more suspicious of Enki's ambitions. Enki, in turn, resented Enlil's authority and his claim over Eden, the fertile lands he had hoped to cultivate. Amid this tension, a new story began to unfold. In the Abzu, Enki studied the creatures that roamed the forests and rivers. Among them he saw forms that startled him, beings who walked upright, who used their forelimbs like hands, whose eyes carried a spark of curiosity. They were primitive, covered in hair, incapable of speech, but something in them stirred a thought too dangerous to ignore. What if these beings could be shaped, refined, uplifted? What if they could be molded into helpers, workers to share the burden of toil? When the miners revolted, throwing down their tools, surrounding Enlil's dwelling with firebrands, the question became urgent. The labor was too heavy, the demands too great. Enlil roared that the rebels should be sent back to Nibiru, punished for disobedience. Enki countered with a proposal that stunned the assembly: create a new being, one suited for the work, a blend of Earth and Nibiru. It would not be slavery, he argued, but survival. The gold must flow, the skies of Nibiru must be healed, and only through innovation could this be done. The council hesitated. Slavery had been abolished on Nibiru long ago. To fashion life was to touch the power of the creator of all. Yet desperation outweighed tradition. The vote was cast, and Enki was given leave to attempt what had never before been tried on Earth. With Ninmah, his half-sister skilled in the arts of healing, and Ningish Zida, his brilliant son versed in the mysteries of the life essence, he withdrew to the House of Life. There, among cages of captured creatures and instruments of bronze and crystal, the first experiments began. Outside, the forests swayed in the winds, the rivers carved their paths, and the stars turned above. Earth waited, unaware that its destiny was being written in secret chambers, where gods in exile sought to shape clay and blood into a new chapter of creation. The House of Life in the Abzu was no temple of worship, but a workshop of strange wonders, where stone tables gleamed with instruments of copper, crystal, and clay. Enki moved among them with the patience of a craftsman and the hunger of a dreamer. By his side was Ninma, the great healer whose hands had steadied the lives of kings on Nibiru, and Ningish Zida, a son born with the gift of deciphering the very code of existence. In cages of woven reeds and rope, they kept the wild creatures of the Abzu, beings who looked almost like men, yet not fully so. They walked upright, but stooped, their bodies heavy with hair, their voices nothing but grunts and cries. These were the raw clay, the unfinished sketches of life on Earth. To most of the Anunnaki, they were beasts. To Enki, they were a possibility. He explained his vision in words heavy with conviction. The toil in the mines was breaking their kin. The cries of rebellion were still echoing. If the mission were to continue, there must be a new worker, one capable of bearing the burden. Why not blend the essence of these earth creatures with the life of Nibiru? Why not fashion a helper in their image, but with enough of their own spark to obey commands and wield tools? To Ninma, it sounded like folly, but Enki's persistence stirred something within her. She had seen the exhaustion in the miner's eyes. She had seen her people, who once commanded skies, bent double in the pits of the Abzu. If survival meant bending the rules of heaven, perhaps survival was reason enough. They began with attempts crude and strange. Enki proposed that a male Anunnaki might lie with a two-legged female creature. Ninma permitted the trial, though her heart recoiled at the thought. The result was failure. No conception, no life born. The gulf between the species was too vast. Next, they tried another way, taking the life essence of Nibiru, what Ningish Zida described as the seed of memory written within blood, and mingling it with the womb of the creature. This too faltered. Some births produced twisted forms, hands unable to grip, eyes clouded, voices mute. These malformed beings were placed gently back into the earth, mourned like shadows of what might have been. Days turned into months. Each attempt seemed to bring despair, yet Enki would not relent. At last he proposed another path, to mold the mixture within the womb of a goddess herself. Only an Anunnaki womb, he reasoned, could bridge the chasm. Ninma agreed, her sense of duty stronger than her dread. She carried the embryo within her, and as the months passed, she walked the halls of the House of Life, with the weight of destiny inside her. At the appointed time, she lay upon the stone table, and Enki himself guided the blade. From her womb was drawn a child, red with the clay of earth, yet bright-eyed with the spark of Nibiru. When Ninma saw the newborn, she wept. The child's skin was smooth, his hands delicate, his form symmetrical. He gazed upward and breathed as though he had always belonged. Ninma named him Adamu, he who is of earth's clay. Enki cradled him with awe, whispering that the image was perfect, not a beast, not wholly Anunnaki, but something new, something between. In Adamu, the burden of toil might at last find its vessel. Excitement spread quickly. Healers from the city of Shurupak came, and 7 volunteered to be birth mothers, to carry more of the new being. Rituals were spoken, incantations calling for unity between heaven and earth. One by one, the women bore children, each a male, each resembling Adamu. They were strong, they were obedient, and they took to simple tasks with ease. The Anunnaki watched in astonishment as these new workers carried baskets, dug soil, hauled stones without complaint. For a moment it seemed the dream had been fulfilled. Yet there was one flaw. These beings, though capable of labor, could not multiply. They were dependent upon the wombs of the goddesses, and the strain was too great. Ninmah herself said they could not continue this way. The house of life was filled with children, but their future was limited. Enki pondered long, his eyes wandering to his own wife, Ninki. She too agreed to bear a mold for the female. A womb opened, a child born, this time a daughter. Her name was Tiamat, the mother of life. She stood beside Adamu, and for the first time, there was male and female of the new race. The Anunnaki gathered in Aridu to witness the pair. Enlil, stern and cautious, looked upon them with suspicion. Were they tools, or were they too close to kin? Marduk, Enki's heir, saw them with a glint of envy, wondering why his father favored these earthlings so deeply. Ninurta, Enlil's warrior son, warned that creation itself was being twisted. But Enki stood firm. Here, he declared, were the children of destiny, the bridge between stars and soil. He returned with them to the house of life, guiding their steps, teaching them to eat, to cover their nakedness, to use their hands. Ningishzida studied them closely, measuring the strands of their essence, the pattern of their blood. He discovered they carried 22 pairs of chromosomes, less than needed for true multiplication. It was Enki who consented to the boldest act yet, to take a fragment of his own life essence and place it within Adamu's rib, and to do the same with Tiamat. When they awoke, their eyes had changed. They looked upon each other with awareness, covering their loins with leaves. They had become not only workers, but beings who knew themselves. This startled Enlil, who came upon them in the garden of Aridu. "Why do you hide your nakedness?" he demanded. Enki explained the gift of knowledge, but Enlil was enraged. He feared that too much had been given, that Enki was playing creator where only the creator of all should reign. In fury, he expelled Adamu and Tiamat from the Eden, sending them back to the toil of the Abzu. Yet exile was not defeat, for in the mines Tiamat conceived. Her womb bore twins, and soon children multiplied across the land. The workers were fruitful, filling the pits and riversides with their labor. The Anunnaki rejoiced, for the burden of gold was eased. Nibiru's skies brightened as the dust of salvation was cast upward once more. Thus the age of mankind began, not as kings nor warriors, but as workers born of necessity, molded from clay and star alike. Their cries rose with the sound of picks in stone, their sweat mixed with the rivers, and their children grew beneath the gaze of gods who were not gods at all, but weary exiles, seeking survival in a world newly theirs. From the marshes of the Abzu to the highlands of Eden, the new workers multiplied, and with them the story of Earth changed forever. where once the mines echoed only with the groans of weary Anunnaki, now the tunnels rang with the rhythm of picks striking stone, baskets filled with ore, and the voices of beings who did not complain. Adamu and Tiamat's children grew into tribes, spreading across valleys and rivers, adapting with startling speed to the heat, the dust, the back-breaking toil. For the Anunnaki, this was both blessing and unease. They marveled at how quickly the earthlings bred, how they endured conditions that weakened even the strongest from Nibiru. But beneath the surface of triumph lay whispers of fear. What had they unleashed? Were these helpers truly theirs to command? Or had they given rise to something beyond their control? Enlil's eyes hardened whenever he looked upon the growing tribes. He saw not helpers but potential rivals, beings that carried a spark too close to their own. He reminded the council that the oath had been to gather gold, not to play gods. But Enki countered with calm words, pointing to the growing stockpiles of ore, to the promise of Nibiru's survival. "Would you deny our home its salvation?" he asked. "Would you rather return to a world gasping for air than accept the help of those born here?" The debate raged, but results spoke louder than doubts. Nibiru's skies grew clearer each passing shar, and the earthlings dug deeper, stronger, without rebellion. In Aridu, Enki raised towers of stone and reed, instructing the new workers in irrigation, in the simple crafts of grinding grain and shaping clay. Some were brought into Eden itself, where they tended fields and herds under Enlil's reluctant watch. The earthlings learned quickly, surprising even their makers. They fashioned huts, sharpened stones, made fire. They sang to their children and lifted their eyes to the stars, not knowing they had been born from them. And as they grew, the children of the Anunnaki began to take notice. It was here that bloodlines and destinies began to twist into knots that could never be undone. Ninmah, once forbidden by Anu from marriage after her affair with Enlil, walked beside Enki in the Abzu. They sought to bear more children together, hoping to create a true heir for Enki, but her womb brought forth only daughters. She returned to Eden, sorrowful, while Enki summoned his wife Damkina and their son Marduk from Nibiru. Damkina became known on Earth as Ninki, and in her Enki found both companionship and renewed ambition. They bore 5 more sons, Nergal, Gibil, Ninagal, Ningishzida, and Dumuzi. Each one would carve his mark into the saga of Earth. Enlil, too, was not without scandal. One summer day he wandered the cedar forests of Eden and came upon a young woman bathing in a stream. Her name was Sud. Enchanted, he drew her into his house of cedar, and there desire overcame restraint. The act was not one of tenderness but of force. When Sud revealed she was with child, Ninmah's fury shook the halls. Enlil was judged before the 7 and exiled to a land of no return. It was Abgal, the pilot, who ferried him to his place of banishment, but there he whispered to Enlil of a hidden truth. The weapons of terror, concealed long ago by Enki, lay in this very land. With such power, freedom was only a step away. Meanwhile, Sud gave birth to a son, and her name was changed to Ninlil. The child was Nanar, the first Anunnaki conceived and born upon Earth itself. This single birth softened judgments. Enlil was pardoned, his exile ended, for how could they deny their brother when his seed had taken root in the soil of Earth? Soon Ninlil bore him another son, Ishkur. The clans of Enki and Enlil grew, their children multiplying, their rivalries deepening. The earthlings too flourished, though they remained bound to labor. Yet among them, Enki watched with a father's pride. They were clever, resilient, unafraid of the elements. He began to whisper that perhaps their purpose was greater than hauling stones. He showed them how to plow the earth, how to guide flocks. They learned to sing prayers, to pour offerings, to recognize the patterns of the heavens. Some of the Anunnaki frowned, muttering that Enki gave too much. But he saw in them more than tools. He saw continuity, a way for life to endure beyond the limits of stars and crowns. Discontent, however, was not erased. The Igigi stationed on Lamu looked down with envy and longing. From their watchtowers they saw the earthlings mate, bear children, laugh beside fires. They themselves had none of this, bound to duty and loneliness. Their whispers turned to schemes. It was Marduk, Enki's proud son, who came to them, offering sympathy and promise. He spoke of their right to love, to bear children, to share in the blessings denied them. Enlil saw only danger. "This planet will be overrun," he warned. "Already Enki has loosed abominations upon us. Now his son will betray us with legions." But his words did little to quiet the restless. On Earth, cities of the Anunnaki rose. In Eden there was Nippur, with its great tower of observation, the tablets of destiny guarded within. In Aridu, Enki expanded his house of life. In the Abzu, mines cut deeper, shafts supported by beams, their darkness lit by the sweat and songs of earthlings. To the people of clay, these cities seemed as wonders beyond comprehension. They watched the skyships rise on pillars of flame, carrying gold to the heavens. They whispered of gods who walked among them, tall, radiant, wielding power over stone and storm. And yet those gods argued like men, loved like men, betrayed like men. The balance was fragile. For every advancement, a quarrel followed. Enlil saw himself as protector of the divine mission, the keeper of order. Enki saw himself as guardian of Earth and its new children. Their disputes were not mere quarrels of brothers, but the seeds of destinies that would shape every legend mankind would inherit. Already, the echoes of their conflict could be heard in stories that would one day be written as myth. Tales of gardens lost, of floods foretold, of towers reaching for the sky. For in the struggles of these exiled gods, mankind was not merely a spectator. Mankind was the inheritance. As centuries turned, gold flowed upward, and Nibiru's skies grew whole again. Yet the hearts of the Anunnaki on Earth grew restless. They had tasted power in a new land, power over both nature and creation. And power, once grasped, is not easily surrendered. The council met often, debating not whether the mission was complete, but what to do with Earth now that it had been tamed. Enlil dreamed of withdrawal, of returning home once the task was done. Enki dreamed of staying, of building something lasting. Between them stretched a chasm no bridge could mend, and within that chasm, humanity waited, unaware that their lives, their very existence, had become the prize of a family feud written across the heavens. The years stretched into centuries, and what began as a mission of survival became a tapestry of rivalries, ambitions, and betrayals. Gold shipments rose steadily from the Abzu, carried by sky chariots to the way stations and beyond to Nibiru. The atmosphere of their home world brightened with each new infusion of dust, but on Earth the weight of destiny grew heavier. The Anunnaki had planted their roots, and like trees that had once been meant as temporary shelter, their dwellings became permanent, their quarrels became dynasties, and their children began to define themselves, not by mission, but by inheritance. It was Marduk, Enki's proud firstborn with Damkina, who became the lightning rod of these tensions. He had grown to manhood on Earth, watching the balance tilt always in Enlil's favor. His uncle controlled Eden and the sacred tablets of destiny, while his father was confined to the mines of the Abzu. To Marduk, this was injustice, a denial of his rightful place. He saw his cousins, Ninurta, Nanar, Ishkur, granted positions of command and favor, while he was left in the shadows of ore and sweat. Each council gathering stoked his resentment. "Am I not the firstborn?" he whispered to Enki. "Do I not deserve a throne?" Enki counseled patience, but in his heart he knew the wound would not heal. The Igigi, stationed on Lamu, felt his discontent like an echo of their own. For long years they had orbited above, lonely watchers condemned to sterile duty. They looked down upon Earth and saw the Earthlings multiplying, tending fields, warming themselves beside wives and children. The Igigi had none of this. Their blood burned with envy, their hands itched with longing. Marduk became their voice, telling them what they already whispered, that they too deserved companionship, that they too should be free to love and to father. His words were a spark dropped into dry tinder. Then came the wedding that would change everything. Marduk had chosen an earthling bride, a woman of beauty descended from Adamu's line, named Sarpanit. It was unprecedented. For an Anunnaki of princely blood to wed a daughter of clay was to cross a line even Enki had not dared. When the news spread, Eden trembled. Enlil's face darkened with rage. Ninmah shook her head in sorrow. "You forsake your rights on Nibiru," she warned. "You tie yourself to a mortal line." But Marduk only lifted his chin higher. "On Nibiru I have no rights," he declared. "On Earth I will carve my own." The wedding was celebrated in Aridu, with feasts, songs, and gifts. A multitude of Earthlings gathered to watch, their eyes filled with awe at the sight of gods joining with mortals. But hidden among the crowd were 200 Igigi, led by a commander named Shamgaz. They had sworn a pact among themselves, a covenant sealed in secrecy. At the moment of celebration, they gave their signal, each seizing a daughter of man and carrying her away. In one night, the Igigi had defied heaven's order, binding themselves to Earthlings, creating unions that could never be untied. The uproar was immediate. Enlil's fury shook the council. He demanded the Igigi be banished, their offspring destroyed, their unions dissolved. But Enki and Ninmah, though troubled, refused. "They have chosen," Ninmah said quietly. "And who are we to unmake life once it has begun?" Marduk defended the Igigi, claiming they only sought what had been denied them unjustly. Enlil stormed from the chamber, vowing that Earth would drown beneath the weight of abominations. The division was now more than brother against brother. It was clan against clan, destiny against destiny. The offspring of these unions became known as the children of the rocket ships. They grew tall and strong, with a vigor that startled even their Anunnaki fathers. Some lived in the Cedar Mountains with their Igigi kin, forming hidden enclaves. Others settled in the domains of Marduk, who welcomed them as proof of his vision. To Enlil, they were a threat that multiplied with each season, proof that chaos was spreading unchecked. To Enki, they were another step in the great experiment, a blending of heaven and earth that could not be undone. It was during this age of turmoil that new cities rose and fell. Inanna, the radiant granddaughter of Enlil, established her presence in Unug, a place of splendor that would later be called Uruk. Nannar, her father, built Ur, a city of thrones and stars. Enlil strengthened Nippur, where the tablets of destiny were guarded. Enki expanded Aridu, his beloved home beside the waters, and dug deeper into the secrets of life. The earthlings themselves multiplied across fields and rivers, some serving in temples, some toiling in mines, all bound within the orbit of their makers. But prosperity was a mask. Beneath it simmered envy and grievance. The Igigi longed for more freedom. Earthlings began to sense their strength, whispering of the day they might live without masters, and the Anunnaki themselves, divided by blood and pride, edged closer to open conflict. The seeds of catastrophe had been sown, though no one yet saw how deeply they would root. One story tells of Lamech, a descendant of the first earthlings, whose wife bore a son with features unlike his kin. Pale of skin, luminous of eye, bearing the mark of something other. Terrified, Lamech confronted her, demanding to know who had fathered the child. She swore it was no Igigi, but one of the High Ones themselves. In her words echoed the truth that the Anunnaki had not merely created mankind. They had begun to mingle with them, shaping bloodlines that blurred all boundaries. For Enlil, this was the final outrage. He called a gathering of the great, demanding that all intermarriages cease, that the children of earth and sky be cut off. Enki opposed him, arguing that destiny could not be undone by decree. Ninmah urged caution, pleading that compassion guide their hand. But the council split, and the shadows of war stretched long. And still the gold flowed, shimmering dust cast into the skies of Nibiru. The mission that had brought them here seemed almost forgotten beneath the weight of feuds. Enki looked upon the earthlings and saw promise, a species that could inherit. Enlil looked upon them and saw corruption, a threat to all that was sacred. Between these two visions hung the fate of both earth and the heavens. In the Cedar Mountains, the children of the Igigi grew stronger. In the Abzu, miners dug deeper. In Eden, watchtowers rose higher. And far above, Nibiru continued its circuit, drawing closer once more to the heart of the solar system. With it would come perturbations of gravity, storms of fire and water, upheavals that neither Enki nor Enlil could yet imagine. The heavens themselves were aligning for a reckoning. The question was no longer whether mankind should serve the gods, but whether mankind would survive the storm that destiny was preparing. The heavens themselves began to whisper of change. When Nibiru swung near the heart of the solar system once more, its vast pull disturbed the orbits of planets and stirred chaos in the skies. On Earth, winds howled with new ferocity, the seas surged against their shores, and storms raged across valleys and mountains. The Anunnaki gazed upward with unease, for they knew the movements of their wandering world were never gentle. Each passage carried with it a toll, a shaking of foundations, a reminder that even gods could not master the heavens. Enki, ever the observer, measured the signs. He and his son Marduk traveled to the moon, tracing the cycles of Earth and its companion with meticulous care. They recorded months and years, mapped constellations, and named the 3 great paths across the sky: the way of Anu, the way of Enlil, the way of Enki. For the first time, the heavens became a calendar, and mankind, though they did not know it, inherited the first lessons in astronomy. Yet while Enki shared his discoveries with excitement, Marduk brooded. "You pass knowledge to others," he accused, "to Ningish Zida, to Ninma, even to the children of Earth. But what of me? Am I not your heir?" Enki reassured him, promising that his destiny was yet to unfold, but Marduk's heart was restless. Meanwhile, Enlil grew weary of disturbances on Earth. The Igigi, bound to their watchposts on Lamu, seethed with discontent. On the planet below, Earthlings multiplied in numbers beyond expectation. Farms spread through Eden's valleys, mines deepened in the Abzu, settlements dotted riversides. To Enlil, it looked less like a mission and more like encroachment. "They swarm like locusts," he muttered to Ninurta. "Soon they will overwhelm the land." He argued for tighter control, for limitations on their numbers, for stricter boundaries. Enki opposed him at every turn, insisting the Earthlings were vital, even destined, to flourish. The brothers' quarrels filled council after council, dividing their kin into factions that aligned more by bloodline than by purpose. Amid this rising tension, the earth itself trembled. Quakes split valleys, floods swept through plains, and fiery eruptions lit the sky. The Anunnaki feared that their mission might falter if chaos spread too far. When reports came of sulfur mists and bitumen choking the land, Enlil demanded evacuation of some settlements. Enki resisted, pointing to the resilience of the Earthlings. "See how they endure," he said. "They walk through dust and fire, where even we falter. They are not frail. They are the children of this planet, and they will inherit it long after we are gone." His words unsettled the council, for they hinted at a future none of them had intended. It was in these days that the great decision was made to build Sipar, the place of the chariots. Until now, the skyships had landed on improvised pads or mountain valleys, but Enlil decreed that a permanent hub must be established. Near the great city of Bad Tibira, close to where gold was refined, construction began on a vast platform, stones fitted with such precision that they gleamed like a mirror to the heavens. To command this station, Enlil did not choose Marduk, though Enki argued passionately for his son. Instead, a younger generation was selected, Utu, son of Nannar, grandson of Enlil. This decision burned like fire in Marduk's heart. He saw it as yet another denial, another theft of his destiny. Utu rose quickly to his role. He supervised the building of Sipar, guided the placement of stones, and oversaw the flow of chariots. With him came Inanna, his radiant sister whose charm and ambition rivaled any of the older lords. She walked the streets of Sipar like a queen, her laughter echoing in the halls, her beauty celebrated by earthlings who began to weave her into songs. Marduk watched from afar, bitterness coiling tighter each day. "They strip me of command. They give my birthright to children," he seethed. To his father he confided, "If I am denied again, I will take what is mine by force." The Igigi heard his words and found in them their own voice. Shamgaz, their leader, whispered that they were ready to rise. They were tired of watching from above, tired of waiting for orders that never came. They wanted lands, wives, and children. Marduk did not discourage them. He reminded them of his own union with Sarpanit, of his defiance in marrying a daughter of Earth. "If I may, so may you," he told them. "Why should the children of heaven be denied the joys of earth?" His words became a banner. But destiny was not only shaped by choice, it was shaped by disaster. When Nibiru's passage drew nearer, its gravitational pull shook the solar system again. On Earth, rivers swelled and mountains crumbled. Lightning split the skies, and storms raged across the seas. Even the hammered bracelet, the belt of asteroids, trembled, sending waves of debris. The Anunnaki looked upward with dread, for they had seen such turmoil before. And among them, whispers began. Perhaps this time the damage would be too great. Perhaps the deluge foretold in visions and dreams was drawing near. One such vision came to Enki himself. In a dream, he saw a radiant figure, Galzu, holding a tablet of lapis lazuli upon which was drawn the design of a great boat. The voice told him that a calamity, ordained by destiny, was inevitable. "Reveal it without breaking your oath," the figure said. "Summon your son, Sasudra, and instruct him in secret. In this vessel shall the seed of mankind survive." Enki awoke trembling. The image of the boat seared into his mind. He searched for Galzu but was told by emissaries that none by that name had been on Earth for generations. The mystery deepened. Had the creator of all sent his own messenger, bypassing even the lords of Nibiru? When Enki confided in Ninmah, she urged caution. "If you speak too plainly, Enlil will accuse you of betrayal. But if you remain silent, mankind will perish." Torn between oath and compassion, Enki resolved to act in secret. He began to prepare Sasudra, a descendant of the earthlings whom he loved as a son, teaching him the ways of cultivation, the craft of building, the art of writing signs upon clay. Quietly, he planted the seeds of survival. Enlil, meanwhile, grew harsher. He declared that the abominations of earthlings and Igigi must not be spared. "Let them drown when the waters come," he said. "Let the earth be cleansed." He forbade teaching the people new skills, forbade giving them medicine or tools. To him, compassion was corruption. To Enki, such cruelty was unthinkable. The rift between brothers widened until it was no longer hidden. It was war in everything but name. And yet despite the storms and portents, life went on. Gold continued to flow. Cities thrived. The earthlings, unaware of the storm gathering above them, built homes, tended fields, raised children. They looked upon their creators with awe, seeing them as gods, never knowing that those same gods were fractured by envy, fear, and pride. Their fate was being sealed in council chambers and dream visions, in quarrels of bloodlines and jealousies of heirs. The heavens darkened with the approach of Nibiru. The seas heaved as though something vast and unseen stirred them from below. Birds flew in restless flocks. Beasts grew uneasy. And in the house of life, Enki sharpened his resolve. He had given humanity birth. He would not allow them to be erased. Whatever the cost, the seed of earth would endure. The signs grew louder with each passing season. Rivers that once nourished valleys swelled beyond their banks, drowning fields. Quakes split the ground beneath cities, and mountains groaned as if restless in their sleep. Even the moon's face changed, marked by new scars from stones pulled loose by Nibiru's gravitational pull. To the Anunnaki, these were omens too great to ignore. The savants of Nibiru sent word that the next passage would bring devastation on a scale not yet seen, a calamity that could sweep the earth clean. Enlil seized upon the warning like a verdict. "The earthlings are not of us," he declared to the council in Nippur. "They are abominations, born of clay and mingled seed. Their numbers rise like floodwaters. Their presence corrupts the purpose for which we came. If destiny decrees destruction, let it come. Let the waters consume them, and let our mission end without the stain of their rebellion upon us." His words struck like iron, and many nodded grimly, weary of quarrels and of the burdens of earth. Enki sat silent at first, his jaw set, his eyes cast upon the floor. But when Enlil demanded all swear an oath of secrecy, to tell no mortal of what was to come, Enki lifted his head. "Why make me swear?" he asked softly. "If nothing I do can change it?" Enlil glared, but the silence that followed was heavy. One by one, the Anunnaki agreed, binding themselves to silence. Enki, too, gave a nod, though in his heart the vow burned. That night the dream returned. Galzu, radiant and ageless, appeared once more with the lapis tablet. "Do not break your oath, but let the chosen know," the voice commanded. "Through your hands, the seed of mankind will survive." When Enki awoke, the tablet lay beside him, etched with the design of a vessel unlike any ship before. He clutched it, his heart pounding. Was Galzu real, or a vision? Had the creator of all intervened directly? The question mattered less than the command itself. In Aridu lived Sasudra, descendant of Adamu, favored by Enki for his wisdom and devotion. Enki loved him as a son, guiding his hand in writing, teaching him the cycles of the stars, instructing him in cultivation. Under the veil of night, Enki approached Sasudra's dwelling. He stood outside the reed walls and spoke not to the man but to the wall itself, so that he might keep his oath yet still pass the message. Reed wall, he whispered, "heed my words. A flood will sweep over the land, ordained by destiny. Build yourself a vessel, not of reeds nor of timber alone, but sealed tight against the waters. Measure its sides by this tablet I leave. Take into it your kin, your seed, the seed of beasts, the seed of plants. Gather food and drink. When the time comes, a guide will show you the way." Inside, Sasudra trembled as the voice carried through the walls. At dawn, he found the tablet, its lines precise, its instructions clear. He fell to his knees, tears in his eyes, for he understood he had been chosen not by chance, but by fate. At once he began preparations, gathering his family and kin, speaking of a journey to the Abzu to disguise his work. Neighbors aided him, not knowing the true purpose, only that the Lord of Aridu had given command. The sound of hammers and saws rose into the air, and a vessel unlike any other took shape. In the cities of Eden, life continued with blind routine. Enlil forbade any mention of catastrophe, enforcing silence with threats. He believed secrecy was mercy, sparing the people terror of what they could not avoid. Yet in his heart lay something colder. The certainty that earth would be cleansed, the experiment of mankind erased. He poured his energy into his own preparations, building new watchtowers, moving the tablets of destiny to Sippar, appointing guards over every sacred place. His focus was not on saving life, but on securing power when the storm passed. Among the Anunnaki, divisions widened. Ninmah wept at the thought of earthlings drowning, recalling the pain of her own failed creations and the children who had survived. Ningish-Zida sided with his father, helping him plan in secret. Marduk, defiant as ever, declared he would remain with Sarpanet and their children no matter the danger. "If my line dies," he said, "it will die upon the soil that bore it." The Igigi, bound to their earth-born wives, echoed his vow. Only a few, like Nannar and Utu, prepared to ascend into orbit and wait out the storm from the safety of the skies. Sasudra worked day and night. His neighbors mocked him, whispering that madness had taken him, but he did not falter. With each beam he set, he felt the weight of generations upon his shoulders. His sons carried planks, his daughters gathered seeds, his wife wove ropes and nets. Beasts were lured into pens, jars were filled with grain and water, baskets sealed with pitch. At last the vessel stood ready, a strange giant among the marshes, its hull gleaming with tar, its belly vast enough to hold the future of a world. The appointed day drew near. Enki sent Ninagal, lord of the waters, to guide the ship when the time came. He carried with him a cedar chest, sealed with resin, within which were stored the life essences of animals gathered by Enki and Ninmah. Eggs, seeds, and the coded patterns of life. "Guard this with your life," Enki instructed, "for in it lies the rebirth of Earth." Then the heavens roared. Nibiru tore past its closest point, and with it came the breaking of chains. In the southern reaches, an ice sheet the size of kingdoms sheared away, crashing into the sea with a force that raised waves higher than mountains. The waters rose like a wall and raced northward, swallowing valleys and plains. Cities vanished beneath the surge. Forests were uprooted, mountainsides stripped bare. The sky turned black with rain, lightning split the heavens, thunder shook the world. Sasudra's vessel groaned as the wave struck, lifting it from its moorings. Water engulfed the land, but the hull held firm, sealed against the fury. Inside, his family clung to one another as beasts bellowed and birds shrieked. For 7 days and 7 nights the storm raged. Outside, the Anunnaki who had taken to orbit watched in horror as the earth disappeared beneath a churning sea. Ninmah wept, her hands covering her face. "My children," she cried, "they are like dragonflies swept away." Inanna wailed. Mourning the beauty turned to mud. Enlil stood grim, silent, watching what he had demanded. Enki, though his heart ached, clung to the hope of the vessel riding the waves. When at last the rains ceased and the winds calmed, Sasudra opened the hatch. He released a dove. It returned, finding no perch. He released a swallow. It too returned. Finally he sent forth a raven, and the bird did not return, for it had found dry land. The waters receded, revealing the peaks of Arata, where the vessel came to rest. Sasudra built an altar upon the mountain and offered lamb in sacrifice, the smoke rising into the sky as thanks to his hidden benefactor. From orbit, Enlil descended with Enki to see the aftermath. The land was coated in mud, cities erased, fields barren. But when he saw the smoke of sacrifice, fury seized him. "Did you not swear an oath?" he shouted at his brother. "Did you not promise silence? How dare you preserve these earthlings?" He moved to strike Sasudra, but Enki placed himself between them. "He is not a mere mortal," he argued. "He carries within him our essence. He is the bridge of survival." Ninmah descended then, her voice steady with sorrow and authority. "On my oath," she declared, "the annihilation of mankind shall never be repeated." Her words rang with finality, and even Enlil's anger faltered. Reluctantly, Enlil relented. He blessed Sasudra and his wife, commanding them to be fruitful and multiply. to replenish the earth. The Anunnaki spread once more across the land, planting seeds, tending flocks, rebuilding what had been lost. But the world was not the same. The deluge had erased the old order, cleansing both earthlings and gods of their illusions. What remained was a blank slate, and upon it new rivalries would be written. For though mankind had survived, the quarrel between Enki and Enlil had only deepened. And in that quarrel lay the blueprint of history itself. When the waters withdrew and the mountains dried, the earth revealed itself as if reborn. Valleys were scoured clean, plains buried beneath layers of mud, and the proud cities of old, Aridu, Nippur, Shurupak, Sipar, lay shattered, their towers reduced to ruins beneath a silence deeper than any grave. The Anunnaki descended from orbit to walk upon the scarred land, their eyes heavy with the knowledge that an age had ended. In the distance, the cedar landing place still stood, its stones weathered but intact, a beacon in a world washed bare. From this anchor, they began again. Survivors among mankind were few, scattered across highlands and distant refuges. Most of the earthlings had been swept away. Yet Sasudra and his kin walked down from the mountains of Arata, bringing with them the seeds of life preserved in their vessel. They planted grains upon terraces, tethered flocks in meadows, and began to repopulate the land. To them, the flood became memory wrapped in reverence, a story passed from parent to child, of gods who raged and gods who wept, of survival bought by faith and hidden mercy. From these whispers, legends would blossom, the tale of a man chosen to survive the waters, of a covenant sealed on a mountaintop. Among the Anunnaki, the deluge had left scars not only upon the earth, but upon their unity. Enlil saw the flood as confirmation that mankind should never have been allowed to thrive. He spoke of destiny, of cleansing, of order restored. Enki saw instead the hand of fate preserving what must endure. He argued that Sasudra's survival proved the creator of all had decreed mankind's future. Their dispute, once personal, now carried the weight of divine justification. Neither could bend without breaking. Yet practicality demanded action. Gold was still needed, and Nibiru's skies once more showed signs of strain. To continue their mission, the Anunnaki had to rebuild. They searched for new deposits, and in the mountains beyond the oceans, Ninurta discovered pure veins exposed by the cataclysm, gleaming in sunlight as if destiny itself had laid them bare. Excitement surged. No longer would they need to labor through endless refining. The treasure of survival lay ready to be gathered. But before mining could resume, they needed new command centers, new ways to anchor heaven and earth. Enlil proposed constructing a new bond, a mountain of signal where the pathways of the sky could be marked. He chose the desolate peninsula that later generations would call Sinai, a land of barren peaks and open skies. Here, he said, the place of the chariots must rise. Twin mountains marked the northern and southern limits, but the central line required a third beacon where no mountain stood. It was Ningishzida, son of Enki, who suggested creating artificial peaks. The council approved, and under his hand, the great pyramids took form. Blocks of stone were quarried and moved with devices that seemed to defy weight, fitted with precision into rising walls. Within, chambers were aligned to the stars, crystals placed to pulse with energy. At the summit, Gibbel crafted a capstone of electrum, polished so bright it shone like the sun. When the final stone was set, the leaders gathered to witness its brilliance. Ninmah recited a hymn. House that is like a mountain, house with a pointed peak, for heaven and earth it is equipped, a beacon for the boats of the sky. Thus the pyramids became not tombs, as later ages would think, but instruments, markers in a grand alignment binding heaven to earth. Beside them, Enki suggested a monument, the form of a lion gazing eastward, bearing the image of Ningish-Zida, designer of the marvel. Enlil consented, but when Marduk heard, his fury ignited. "Is not my destiny written in the stars?" he demanded. "Shall not my image face the dawn?" His protests poisoned the gathering, for each prince now wanted a domain, a city, a monument to his own line. Rivalries sharpened, and Ninmah, weary of strife, sought compromise. The world, she said, was wide enough for all. Let the habitable lands be divided, each with its portion. Thus the earth was portioned into regions. The first region, Eden and its valleys, was given to Enlil and his heirs. The second, the land of the two Narrows, which would one day be called Egypt, was granted to Enki and his line, though to appease Marduk, he was made master of its southern highlands. The third, in the far east beyond 7 mountain ranges, was awarded to Inanna, who clamored for her own dominion. The fourth, the desolate peninsula of the chariots, was reserved as a sacred zone, forbidden to mankind, a place only for the skyships. Ninmah herself was honored with Tilmun, the mountaintop land, and named mistress of the mountainhead. For a time, peace returned. Gold flowed again, cities rose anew, and mankind multiplied under the watchful gaze of their masters. In Kish, kingship was established, a system where human rulers governed cities in the name of their divine patrons. These kings learned writing, mathematics, agriculture, and metallurgy, taught directly by the Anunnaki. The line between servant and sovereign blurred as earthlings began to sit on thrones, holding scepters fashioned by hands that were not their own. To the people, this was glory beyond measure. To the Anunnaki, it was necessity, a way to manage the growing numbers without bearing the burden alone. Yet even within this order, shadows lengthened. Inanna, restless and ambitious, tricked Enki into granting her the sacred emes, formulas of kingship, of crafts, of music, of war. Drunk on their power, she returned to her city, Unug, and proclaimed herself goddess of love and battle, surrounding herself with warriors and priests. Marduk, watching from his strongholds, fumed. "They grant her what is denied me," he raged. "Do they not see that the age is mine? The stars of the Ram rise to herald my time." He began to gather followers, summoning the Igigi and their children to build for him a city of his own, a tower that would pierce the sky. Thus the seeds of Babel were sown. Enlil, alarmed, devised a counter. To scatter Marduk's followers, he confounded their tongues, giving each land a different speech and script. Where once they spoke as one, now they quarreled, unable to understand. The tower stood incomplete, a monument to division. But the act deepened bitterness, for Marduk swore vengeance, proclaiming that he would return as supreme, no matter how many ages it took. The deluge had wiped the world clean, but it had not erased the fault lines between brothers, sons, and daughters. Instead, it gave them fresh soil in which to grow, watered by ambition and envy. Mankind, caught between them, became both tool and witness, inheritors of cities, languages, and myths that were never entirely theirs. The earth was no longer a wild frontier, it was a chessboard, and every piece moved according to the will of the players above. From the mountains of Arata to the plains of Sumer, fires burned once more, not from destruction but from the birth of civilizations. And yet beneath the light, the shadow of rivalry stretched, promising that peace would not last. For every city built, a quarrel awaited. For every crown bestowed, a conflict sharpened. The flood had ended an age, but the storm of ambition had only just begun. Civilization rose from mud and memory, and with it came new tales, etched not only on clay tablets but in the living breath of cities. Kish became the first seat of human kingship, where rulers chosen by the Anunnaki governed in their stead. The earthlings rejoiced at the gift, believing the scepter placed in a man's hand came from heaven itself. They plowed fields, brewed beer, forged tools, and learned the law, each skill a reflection of the MEs Enki had once crafted and Inanna had cunningly claimed. The line between mortal and divine blurred as humans began to see themselves not merely as workers, but as rulers under the watch of gods. Yet the Anunnaki themselves grew restless. Inanna, radiant and insatiable, wielded her stolen MEs with pride. In Unug, later to be called Uruk, she built temples filled with music, dance, and warriors ready to march at her command. She proclaimed herself goddess of love and battle, the morning and evening star incarnate. Men adored her, women feared her, and even the Anunnaki treated her with caution. She whispered of power and conquest, of kingship destined to move from city to city, always under her gaze. Enlil watched with suspicion, Enki with wry amusement, and Marduk with smoldering rage. Marduk had not forgotten Babel. His attempt to claim the heavens had been thwarted by Enlil's cunning, his followers scattered by tongues that no longer matched. Yet in his heart he held to prophecy, convinced that the age of the ram, his sign, was near. He declared himself Ra in the lands of the Two Narrows, reshaping temples and monuments to bear his mark. He replaced Ningishzida's image on the lion-faced monument with his own son's, a declaration that his line, not another's, would face the rising sun. His father Enki counseled restraint, urging patience, but Marduk's bitterness had fermented into destiny. He told his followers that the stars themselves proclaimed his time, and he would not wait quietly. The kings of Kish reigned in cycles, each enthroned with ritual blessings from Nippur, where the tablets of destiny were guarded. Among them was Etana, remembered as the Shepherd King. The stories say he longed for a child and prayed for aid. One night he was taken into the heavens upon the wings of an eagle, shown the stars, and promised the seed of life. Whether dream or flight, Etana returned with renewed vigor, and his line endured. The people saw in this a miracle, proof that heaven favored their kings. But behind the miracle lay the quiet hand of the Anunnaki, ever shaping, ever guiding. Inanna's ambitions did not rest. When kingship moved from Kish to Unug, she seized the chance to elevate her chosen rulers, men bound to her through devotion and seduction. She trained them as warriors, adorned them in finery, and led them into battles that expanded her influence. Her city thrived with walls that gleamed, temples that soared, and processions that filled the streets with music and incense. Yet beneath the splendor, the price of ambition was blood. Wars flared between city-states, each claiming divine favor, each leaving behind ruins that later ages would puzzle over. Amid this tumult lived a king who would become legend, Gilgamesh of Uruk. He was 2/3 divine, 1/3 mortal, born of a union between Anunnaki blood and human womb. His strength was unmatched, his beauty startling, his restlessness unending. He built walls around his city so tall that they seemed to challenge the sky itself. Yet in his heart burned a fear that no wall could keep at bay. The fear of death. Gilgamesh sought immortality, not satisfied with thrones or temples. He questioned his mother, Ninsun, who told him that only in Nibiru could he hope to escape mortality. Driven by this, he embarked on journeys beyond his city, guided by dreams and omens. The epic carved in later ages tells of his friend Enkidu, a wild man tamed by the touch of love and friendship, who walked beside him on adventures. They slew a monster in the cedar forest, a guardian of the gods' domain, and faced the bull of heaven, sent by Inanna herself when Gilgamesh spurned her advances. The battles shook the land, and Enlil, hearing of their defiance, decreed punishment. Enkidu fell ill and died, leaving Gilgamesh broken with grief. His quest for eternal life led him to Sasudra, survivor of the flood, who revealed the secret plant that preserved youth. Yet even that treasure slipped away, stolen by a serpent, leaving only wisdom in its place. That mortality could not be undone. While Gilgamesh wandered, Marduk pressed forward. In Egypt he raised temples to himself, instructing priests in rituals that promised life beyond death. He declared that kings should build tombs aligned with the stars, gateways for their souls to ascend to the imperishable planet. His words spread like fire, and dynasties began to carve monuments that reached toward eternity. To his followers, he was not just a god, but the god, supreme above all. To his rivals, he was a usurper, a threat to the fragile balance. The other Anunnaki convened, alarmed by his growing influence. Enlil demanded limits, warning that Marduk's defiance could ignite war. Enki defended his son, though even he could not ignore the danger. Ninurta, warrior son of Enlil, prepared armies, while Inanna whispered that she could counter Marduk's power with her own alliances. The stage was set for conflict, not of mortals alone, but of gods and their children. In the cities, mankind watched and waited, caught between rival banners. They built temples, offered sacrifices, prayed to one deity today and another tomorrow, never certain which hand guided their fate. They saw storms destroy harvests, armies raze towns, rulers rise and fall. To them, the gods seemed mighty and capricious. But what they did not see was that those gods were fractured by the same flaws as men: jealousy, pride, hunger for power. The flood had ended one world, but the centuries that followed gave rise to another, a world of kings and empires, of myths and wars that carried echoes of celestial rivalries. Each city carried its patron, Ur to Nannar, Lagash to Ninurta, Aridu to Enki, Uruk to Inanna, Memphis to Ra. And in each city, mankind became the vessel of divine feuds, their blood spilled to settle disputes born in the stars. The councils grew more bitter. Enlil spoke of destiny and order, of keeping mankind in their place. Enki argued for knowledge and freedom, reminding them that the earthlings were not beasts but kin. Ninmah pleaded for compassion, weary of endless strife. But Marduk's voice thundered above all, that he alone was destined to rule, that the heavens proclaimed his age, and that no decree of council could prevent it. The earth trembled not only with storms and quakes, but with the march of armies. Bronze clashed against bronze, cities fell, temples burned. And amid the chaos, mankind wrote their first stories, of heroes and monsters, of gods who walked among them, of quests for immortality. They did not know these stories were echoes of a greater drama, one that stretched from Nibiru to earth, from the flood to the building of empires. As the constellations turned and the ram rose slowly in the night sky, Marduk's followers grew bolder. Inanna schemed, Ninurta armed, Enlil fumed, and Enki watched with heavy heart. The age that dawned after the waters had not brought peace. It had only prepared the ground for another storm. And this time, the battle would not be between heaven and sea, but between brother and brother, God and God, with mankind caught in the middle. The centuries following Gilgamesh's quest unfolded like a drumbeat of ambition and betrayal. Kingship shifted from city to city, each enthronement sanctified by rituals that traced their lineage back to the Anunnaki. Yet behind the solemn prayers and offerings burned rivalries older than any throne. Inanna, mistress of Uruk, spread her influence far beyond her walls. Her temple, the Iana, gleamed with jewels and weapons, a place where love and war intertwined, where warriors swore loyalty and lovers whispered devotion in the same breath. She hungered for more than glory. She craved dominion. Her eyes turned to the lands of her rivals, especially those under Marduk's sway. Marduk, proclaiming himself Ra in Egypt, responded with equal fire. His priests taught of the Duat, the pathway of souls, promising that kings who served him would ascend after death to join him among the imperishable stars. He reshaped monuments, demanded loyalty, and spread his cult like wildfire. To his followers, he was no longer one among many gods, but the god, supreme above all others. The clash between Inanna's fiery ambition and Marduk's relentless claim to supremacy began to pull the world into a conflict that would scar the earth as surely as the flood had done. The other Anunnaki watched with growing dread. Enlil called for caution, warning that Marduk's hunger threatened the fragile balance. Enki defended his son, though his heart grew heavy, for he saw how destiny and defiance tangled into knots no wisdom could untie. Ninurta, Enlil's warrior son, sharpened his weapons, declaring he would not allow Marduk to seize what belonged to the council. Nanar and Utu shifted uneasily, bound by kinship to both sides. And Ninmah, weary with age and sorrow, pleaded for peace, though her words fell like rain upon stone. Inanna took matters into her own hands. She marched with armies of Uruk, her warriors carrying banners embroidered with the star of Venus. She wielded weapons of brilliance, relics of the heavens, which could scorch stone and blind enemies. She stormed the strongholds of Enki's sons, demanding Marduk reveal himself. Her rage was personal. She had once loved Dumuzi, Enki's youngest, and his death, whether by fate or intrigue, had left her thirsting for vengeance. She blamed Marduk for robbing her of that bond, and swore that his line would pay. Ninurta joined her cause, leading his storm-bird skyship into battle. From its wings poured beams of fire that cut through enemy walls. Ishkur, lord of storms, unleashed thunder and lightning that shattered cities. Marduk's followers fled before them, retreating into the land of the Two Narrows. There, amid temples aligned to the stars, Marduk prepared his final defense. He withdrew into the Great Pyramid, sealing its passages with sliding stones, surrounding himself with crystals that pulsed with power. To him, this was not retreat, but coronation. "Let them come," he said. "The pyramid is my throne, my temple, my fortress. Here destiny shall crown me." Inanna and Ninurta laid siege. Their weapons pounded against the walls, shaking the desert, but the pyramid's stones held. The air crackled with energy as beams from within struck back, scorching the sands and blasting skyships. Horon, son of Marduk, fought valiantly to defend his father, but Inanna's brilliance weapon struck his eye, blinding him. Even so, he survived, becoming a symbol of resilience. The battle raged, threatening to consume them all, until Ninmah intervened. She called upon Enlil and Enki, demanding they end the madness. "Will you bury us all in the ruins of this mountain?" she cried. "Have you not learned from the flood? Must every age end in destruction?" Reluctantly, Enlil agreed to compromise. Marduk would not be executed but exiled to the land of no return. The pyramid was breached, not with weapons but with cunning, as Ningishzida devised a secret passage. He found Marduk within, cloaked in shadows, his heart heavy but unbroken. Sarpanit and their son Nabu clung to him, refusing to leave. Enki himself came, torn between love for his son and duty to peace. "Live, my child," he urged. "Go into exile and preserve your line. Destiny may yet return to you." Marduk, raging, vowed vengeance, but he departed with his family, banished to distant lands. The pyramid was stripped of its great stones, its crystals dismantled. The apex stone, once gleaming brighter than the sun, was shattered by Ninurta's weapon, leaving it scarred for ages to come. A new beacon was raised on Mount Mushu, where salvaged crystals were set to guide skyships. The balance of power shifted once more. Enlil rewarded his sons. Ninurta was made his surrogate in all lands, Ishkur given lordship of the Cedar Mountains, Nanar granted everlasting rule in Ur. Utu remained commander of the place of the chariots, and Inanna, though denied her own region, was placated with authority over Unug. Enki's line was diminished, their leader banished, their cities weakened. But peace was fragile. Inanna, emboldened, demanded more. She declared that the heritage of Dumuzi gave her claim to lands beyond her city, that she should inherit dominion through marriage denied. When denied again, her ambition turned to vengeance. She wove alliances, seduced kings, and plotted wars, always seeking to outshine Marduk, always yearning to fill the void left by his exile. Meanwhile, the children of Marduk did not disappear. Nabu, his son, remained a prophet, gathering followers who saw in him the promise of return. Shamgaz and the Igigi, bound to their earth-born wives, spread across mountains and valleys, raising children who bore both human resilience and celestial vigor. These offspring, heroes and giants, began to influence the course of human history, leading tribes, building cities, forging legacies that blurred the line between myth and flesh. The world was no longer a single mission site, but a patchwork of kingdoms and cults. Each city had its patron, each land its god, each temple its rituals. To mankind, the gods seemed eternal, their quarrels divine. But within the council of the Anunnaki, the reality was clear. They were fractured, their unity shattered, their purpose lost to rivalry. Enki pondered this with sorrow, wondering if Galzu's prophecy had always meant more than survival. that mankind was meant not only to endure, but to inherit. As the centuries passed, Marduk's exile grew restless. He wandered distant lands, watching the skies, waiting for the moment when the ram would rise fully in the heavens. He told his followers that the age would come when he would reclaim what was his, when Babel would be rebuilt, when his supremacy would be sealed not by decree, but by destiny. The stars turned slowly, each constellation a measure of time, and with every movement, the storm of his return drew closer. The gods had survived the flood and rebuilt the world, but in their hearts they carried new weapons, ambition sharpened by memory, vengeance sharpened by pride, and mankind, still young, still eager, would become the battlefield upon which their destinies collided. The stage was set for wars not of nature but of will, wars that would echo in myth as battles of gods, but in truth were the struggles of exiles who could not escape their own flaws. Exile did not silence Marduk. From the lands of his banishment he spoke to those who would listen, whispering that destiny could not be denied. He wandered from valley to valley, mountain to mountain, gathering tribes who looked upon his stature and voice with awe. To them he was not a defeated prince, but a god cast unjustly aside, a rightful ruler waiting for his appointed age. He told them of the stars, of the ram that would rise in the heavens, heralding his supremacy. Slowly, his following grew, bound not by decrees of councils, but by faith in prophecy. Inanna, ever watchful, saw the danger. Her ambitions had not waned since the Pyramid Wars, and she feared the return of her rival more than any. She tightened her hold on Uruk, lured kings with promises of immortality through her embrace, and filled her temples with music and weapons alike. To her, love and war were threads of the same weave, tools to shape destiny. Yet even as her influence spread, Marduk's shadow lengthened. She demanded from the council that his return be forbidden, that his name be struck from the records of kingship. Enlil, still wary of Enki's line, supported her call. But Enki resisted, his heart torn between loyalty to the mission and devotion to his son. Meanwhile, mankind continued to multiply. Cities flourished across Mesopotamia, each a jewel of clay and stone, reflecting the favor of its patron deity. Ur thrived under Nannar, glowing with silver light. Lagash grew under Ninurta, strong with armies and forges. Kish remained a seat of kingship, its rulers proclaiming authority on behalf of the gods. Aridu, though humbled, still stood as Enki's sanctuary of wisdom. And Unug, under Inanna, shone with splendor, its walls echoing with songs of both devotion and fear. Each city looked skyward, not only for storms and stars, but for the will of the Anunnaki who walked among them. Yet beneath prosperity stirred unease. Nabu, son of Marduk, became a voice of prophecy. He traveled among tribes, calling them to his father's cause, proclaiming that the heavens themselves declared Marduk's age. His words carried fire, igniting hope in some and dread in others. Temples dedicated to Ra began to rise even outside Egypt, a sign that Marduk's reach had not diminished but expanded. Inanna raged at this intrusion, declaring him a usurper, and swore to strike wherever his influence spread. The council convened again, and once more the hall in Nippur was filled with clashing voices. Enlil thundered that Marduk's defiance threatened the balance of the world. Ninurta urged military action, declaring he could crush the rebels swiftly. Inanna demanded war, eager to wield her brilliance weapons once more. Enki pleaded restraint, warning that blood spilled among brothers could never be recalled. Ninmah sighed, her voice heavy with sorrow, begging them to remember the flood and the lesson of survival. But no compromise was reached. The assembly fractured, each leaving with their anger unquenched. Outside the council, mankind bore the weight of these divisions. Armies marched in the names of gods, razing fields, burning cities. Kings shifted allegiance with the winds, one day swearing to Enlil's house, the next to Enki's. Temples crumbled and were rebuilt, each time dedicated to a different patron. The people whispered of gods at war, and in their stories heroes became instruments, kings became pawns, and blood became the language of heaven. In the far western lands, beyond the sea, Ningish-Zida, cast out by Marduk, found refuge. To the people there he became known as Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, teaching them astronomy, building temples aligned with the stars. His departure left Egypt firmly in Marduk's grip, but his wisdom spread across oceans, seeding new civilizations. To Enki, this was bittersweet. One son cast aside, another consumed by ambition. He wondered if destiny had written tragedy upon his house from the beginning. Then came the moment that would shatter all restraint. Marduk, no longer content with prophecy, declared himself openly supreme. He entered Babylon, the city raised upon the ruins of Babel, and proclaimed it his eternal seat. He named its temple Esagila, the house of the raised head, and invited all gods to assemble there. "My covenant is eternal," he declared. "Accept me, or be cast aside by the turning of the heavens." His followers erupted in devotion, their chants echoing across plains. To Enlil, this was treason beyond forgiveness. The council met in secret. Enlil spoke with fury, demanding action before Marduk consumed the world. Ninurta and Ishkur pledged their weapons, eager for battle. Even Nannar, normally cautious, admitted that Babylon's rise threatened all. Enki alone opposed them, warning that destruction would wound Earth itself. But his pleas went unheard. It was Nergal, fierce lord of the underworld, who made the fateful suggestion: unleash the weapons of terror. Hidden since the early days, buried in secret places, these weapons carried the power to melt mountains, to scorch cities, to unleash death upon all that breathed. Enlil hesitated, but Nergal pressed, reminding him that Marduk's ambition could not be stopped by conventional means. At last Enlil agreed, but with conditions. "The cities must be vacated," he ordered. "The people must be spared. Only the strongholds of Marduk and his allies shall be struck." His voice was heavy, as though he knew even then the promise was hollow. He entrusted the weapons to Ninurta and Nergal, warning them to wield them with precision. Yet even as he spoke, the specter of calamity loomed. For once unleashed, such power could not be contained. Enki, learning of the plan, was horrified. He confronted his brother, pleading that they not repeat the arrogance of the flood, that Earth not be scarred again. But Enlil was resolute. "You gave mankind too much," he said. "You sowed rebellion with your compassion. Now we must reap the harvest." Enki turned away in despair, knowing his words were wasted. The weapons were prepared in secret, their names whispered with dread: the one without rival, the blazing flame, the mountain melter, the vaporizer of living things. They had not been touched in ages, for their power was too great, too final. Now they were awakened, glowing with fire that seemed to hunger for release. Ninurta carried some, Nergal the rest. Together they waited for Enlil's signal. Marduk, in Babylon, celebrated his supremacy. He gathered his followers, feasted in Escalating, proclaimed that destiny had crowned him. He did not know that in the mountains warriors were readying weapons that could erase not only his kingdom, but the very land it stood upon. Nabu, his son, pleaded for restraint, urging his father to seek peace. But Marduk brushed him aside. "Peace is surrender," he said. "The heavens proclaim me. Let them challenge destiny if they dare." When Enlil gave the signal, the sky itself seemed to tremble. Ninurta struck first, hurling his weapon upon the heart of the western lands. Flames rose, mountains split, rivers boiled. Nergal followed, releasing his fury upon the 5 cities of the plain. In moments, they were vaporized, their people erased as though they had never been. The winds shifted, carrying with them a dark cloud, a poison that clung to earth and air alike. It spread swiftly, unstoppable, devouring life in its path. From Aridu to Nippur, from Ur to Kish, the land of Sumer was engulfed. Crops withered, waters turned bitter, men gasped and fell where they stood. Even the Anunnaki fled in terror, for they had not foreseen the storm they had unleashed. Enki watched in horror as the land he had nurtured became a wasteland. "Brother against brother," he whispered, "and in our quarrel we have slain the earth itself." Ironically, Babylon was spared. The winds shifted at the last moment, leaving Marduk's city untouched. To his followers, this was proof of his destiny, a sign that the Creator of all had favored him. To Enlil, it was a bitter confirmation that fate itself had chosen Marduk, no matter how fiercely he resisted. The once fertile land of Sumer lay in ruin, its cities silenced, its rivers poisoned. The golden age of the first kingdoms was over, drowned not by water but by fire and poison from the hands of gods themselves. In the silence that followed, the Anunnaki gathered to survey the devastation. Enlil was grim, but unrepentant. Ninurta and Nergal, though triumphant, were shaken by what they had done. Enki stood apart, his heart broken, knowing that history would judge them not as saviors but as destroyers. And mankind, scattered and broken, would carry the memory of this day as myths of divine wrath, stories of fire from the sky, of plagues that darkened the sun. The truth was simpler and more terrible. The gods had turned their weapons against themselves, and Earth had paid the price. The silence that settled over Sumer after the weapons fell was heavier than any storm. Where once fields of barley rippled in the wind and flocks dotted the meadows, there lay only wastelands streaked with ash. The poisoned wind had swept across the land like a ghost, unseen but merciless, leaving bodies in its wake. From Aridu in the south to Sippar in the north, the land of kings was no more. Temples were abandoned, their statues toppled, their altars cold. Even the Anunnaki, who had commanded armies and built cities, fled the ruins, their power broken by their own hands. And yet, amid this devastation, Babylon stood untouched. The poison cloud had veered, sparing its walls, its temple Esagila, and its people. To the followers of Marduk, this was no accident, but destiny made visible. They proclaimed that the Creator of all had shielded their Lord, that his supremacy was written not only in the stars, but now in the very survival of his city. Marduk seized upon this with fire in his voice. He gathered the survivors, both human and Anunnaki, and declared, "See, the gods who sought to destroy me have destroyed themselves. The heavens have spared me alone. This land is mine, and I am its ruler." The Council of the Anunnaki met in secret, shaken by what had unfolded. Enlil, grim and weary, admitted the truth he could no longer deny. "Destiny has chosen," he said. "The storm spared Babylon. Marduk's supremacy is confirmed." He turned to his son, Ninurta, once intended to inherit leadership, and placed a hand upon his shoulder. "The rank I reserved for you must now pass to him." With those words, the power of Enlil's house dimmed, and the torch passed to Enki's son, though not by choice but by inevitability. Enki watched silently, torn between sorrow and pride. He had always defended Marduk, always argued for his right to destiny, yet the cost was unbearable. The land he had nurtured, the cities he had raised, the people he had taught, all lay in ruin. To see his son crowned in the shadow of that destruction was no triumph but a bitter inheritance. And yet, the law of fate could not be ignored. He embraced Enlil, not as foe, but as brother, and for the first time in ages the two found themselves united in despair. The Anunnaki prepared to depart from the wasted lands, scattering to the regions that had survived. Enlil withdrew with Ninurta to distant mountains beyond the western seas, vowing never again to challenge destiny. Ishkur returned to his storm-swept highlands, his power diminished but intact. Nannar resumed rule in Ur, which, though scarred, still endured with his silver light. Utu maintained the place of the chariots in the desolate peninsula, keeping open the pathway to Nibiru. Inanna lingered in Uruk, her ambitions smoldering, though the brilliance of her star had dimmed after the devastation. Marduk established himself fully in Babylon. He raised new temples, crowned kings in his name, and declared the beginning of his era. He renamed the city Babili, the gateway of the gods, proclaiming it the navel of the earth. His son Nabu became his prophet, carrying messages across lands, rallying tribes, and planting shrines wherever his feet touched. From the ruins of Sumer, a new order emerged, one not of shared dominion, but of singular supremacy. To resist was to deny fate itself. Yet not all bowed willingly. Inanna, still furious over the death of Dumuzi and the loss of her region, plotted ceaselessly. She seduced rulers, whispered rebellions, and raised armies in the shadows. Time and again she clashed with Marduk's growing power, but each defeat deepened her desperation. Legends grew around her, of a goddess who loved fiercely, who waged wars for vengeance, who lured men to their doom. But in truth, she was a rival unwilling to surrender to the tides of destiny. Meanwhile, mankind bore the scars of the great calamity. Crops failed for years, rivers ran foul, and the air carried sickness. Families wandered in search of food, tribes scattered, kingships dissolved. From this suffering arose myths of divine wrath, tales of cities consumed by fire from the heavens, of gods who punished mankind for sins unspoken. Yet through hardship, the survivors rebuilt, guided by the remnants of knowledge the Anunnaki had left. Slowly, fields were replanted, herds regathered, and new kings sat upon thrones, this time in Babylon. Anu himself, hearing of the devastation, came once more from Nibiru with his consort, Antu. Their ship descended to the Cedar Mountains, where a great procession awaited. Enki, Enlil, and Ninmah greeted them, aged and weary, their faces lined not only by time, but by sorrow. The cities presented offerings, though they had little to give. In Unug, Inanna sought to impress her grandfather, dressing in finery and recounting her victories, but Anu's gaze was heavy with disappointment. He walked through the ruins of summer, saw the mud where once towers had stood, and wept openly. "This land was a jewel," he said. "Now it lies broken and by your hands." The council convened in Unuki, a new city raised as a sanctuary for Anu's visit. Here, Enlil confessed the truth of Galzu's prophecy, the vision he had kept secret even as the weapons were unleashed. Enki listened with fury, demanding why his brother had withheld such knowledge. Enlil replied with weary honesty, "Because fate cannot be escaped. Because even prophecy cannot distinguish destiny from choice. We are instruments, not masters." For once, Enki had no reply. In the end, Anu decreed a new order. The habitable lands would be divided into 4 regions. The first, Sumer, still under Enlil's line, but diminished. The second, Egypt, under Marduk as Ra. The third, distant lands beyond mountains and rivers, granted to Inanna for her persistence. The fourth, the sacred zone of the chariots, forbidden to mankind, overseen by Utu. Ninmah received a land of her own, Tilmun, a sanctuary where she could rest and heal. And to mankind was given kingship, not as servants alone, but as rulers, to bear the weight of civilization under the guidance of their divine patrons. Thus began a new age, scarred by memory, yet alive with promise. The Anunnaki no longer stood united. Their rivalries had carved the world into fragments. But in their division, mankind found space to grow. Cities rose again, languages flourished, and the stories of gods at war became the myths of nations. The devastation of Sumer faded into legend, told as tales of divine judgment, of plagues and fire, of a wrathful sky. Few remembered that it was not the will of heaven, but the folly of gods that had brought ruin. Marduk reigned supreme, yet his triumph was not unchallenged. Nabu spread his influence, priests exalted his name, and kings built temples to honor him. But Inanna still schemed, Ninurta still sharpened his weapons, and Enlil still guarded the tablets of destiny. Enki withdrew to Aridu, pondering the mysteries of fate, wondering whether mankind would one day surpass their makers. The land bore scars, the heavens bore omens, and destiny continued its slow turn. The age of the bull was ending, the age of the ram dawning, and with it the promise and the peril of Marduk's supremacy. For though he ruled Babylon unopposed, the seeds of resistance remained, waiting for the moment when the storm of ambition would rise again. The smoke of Sumer's ruin had barely settled when Babylon began to rise as the beating heart of a new age. Marduk's supremacy was acknowledged in council and whispered in every city, yet his crown was not made of peace. It was forged in resentment, hammered by the silence of rivals who obeyed outwardly but plotted within. To the people, Babylon's ziggurats stood like ladders to heaven, a testimony that their god had triumphed when fire consumed all else. But to the Anunnaki, those terraces of brick and bitumen were less a monument than a provocation, a reminder that Marduk claimed not just a throne, but the destiny of Earth itself. Inanna, restless and unsatisfied, returned to her city of Uruk with fury blazing in her eyes. She had watched Marduk seize what she believed the stars once promised her. She had watched kings bow to him while her own demands were dismissed. The loss of Dumuzi still burned in her heart, and with each new temple raised to Ra, her hunger for vengeance deepened. In the evening she stood upon the walls of Uruk, her gaze fixed eastward, whispering to herself that no age lasts forever. She began to weave a web of seductions, binding human kings to her with promises of love and power, using her beauty as a weapon sharper than any blade. Mankind, caught in this divine tug-of-war, continued to rebuild from the ashes. New dynasties rose, claiming descent from flood survivors, boasting of divine favor. Kingship became not just governance, but ritual, each enthronement sanctified by priests who invoked the names of their patrons. In Ur, Nanar's priests mapped the cycles of the moon. In Lagash, Ninurta's followers built canals and fortresses. In Kish, warriors swore loyalty to Enlil's legacy. And in Babylon, Marduk's priests taught hymns proclaiming him as supreme, the one who commands destiny. To the people, these were gods beyond reach, yet their rivalries spilled blood upon mortal soil. Among the younger generation of mankind, memories of the flood had become legend. They spoke of gods who unleashed fire, of cities erased in a single day, of a sky that turned dark with poison. Some revered these powers with awe, others whispered in fear. Yet slowly, they began to see themselves not only as servants, but as heirs. They tilled fields, built homes, traded across rivers, and discovered that life continued even when gods quarreled. A subtle shift had begun. Mankind was learning to endure not just under the shadow of gods, but despite them. Still, the Anunnaki could not relinquish control. They walked among humans as kings in all but name, directing wars, deciding borders, dictating rituals. But with each generation the lines blurred. Earthling kings began to claim divine parentage, weaving themselves into myths that placed them closer to heaven than to clay. Gilgamesh's legacy lingered. His quest for immortality echoed in the hearts of rulers who built monuments to outlast death. They were mortal, yet they wrapped themselves in divinity, and the people believed. The gods encouraged this, for it anchored their power. Yet it also planted seeds of independence. Inanna, frustrated by council decrees, turned to these kings as her instruments. She whispered to them in chambers heavy with incense, promising victory if they fought in her name. Some answered eagerly, leading campaigns that spread her banner across the plains. Others fell under her spell only to find themselves discarded when their usefulness waned. Her temple in Uruk grew infamous, a place where power was granted with a kiss and withdrawn with fury. Enlil scorned her methods. Enki shook his head in weary amusement, but none could deny her influence. She became not merely a goddess, but an embodiment of human desire. Love, lust, vengeance, ambition, all bound into one figure. Meanwhile, Marduk pressed his dominance further. He ordered the rebuilding of Esagila in Babylon, greater than before, its walls thick, its terraces climbing higher. He demanded that all cities send tribute, and those who refused felt the weight of his wrath. Armies marched in his name, carrying the golden emblem of the sun. His son, Nabu, became his voice, traveling across lands, establishing shrines, and teaching hymns that proclaimed his father as the sole ruler of heaven and earth. To many tribes and nations, Marduk was no longer one among many, but the only. The old order of shared dominion was fading. This growing centralization unsettled the others. Ninurta sharpened his weapons once more, declaring that Marduk's arrogance threatened the balance of earth. Ishkur rallied storms, but his voice carried less weight than before. Nana retreated into his lunar temples, his power waning. Utu guarded the chariot place in silence, his eyes fixed more on the heavens than the quarrels of his kin. And Ninmah, aging and sorrowful, withdrew to Tilmun, where she tended gardens and counseled peace to those who would listen. It was Enki, more than any, who pondered what was unfolding. He saw his son enthroned, yet feared what his rule might bring. He walked among earthlings, listening to their songs and laments, watching them build and dream. He wondered whether Galzu's prophecy had always been about this, not the supremacy of one god, but the endurance of mankind. Perhaps the creator of all had allowed the flood, the wars, the devastation, not to destroy but to test, to strip away illusions until humans could stand on their own. The thought brought him both comfort and sorrow. But destiny is rarely still. The ram began to rise fully in the skies, its horns gleaming in the constellations. Priests whispered that the age of Marduk had truly dawned. His followers grew bolder, declaring that Enlil's time was past, that Inanna's star had dimmed, that only Ra remained supreme. Babylon swelled with people, temples flourished, markets bustled. Yet in the streets of Uruk and Kish, whispers of rebellion lingered, carried by those who still revered Inanna or Ninurta. The balance of power was a knife's edge, and any spark could ignite the world again. Inanna found her spark. She sought to expand her dominion into the eastern mountains, raising armies of humans trained not just to serve, but to fight as soldiers in her name. She armed them with weapons forged in her temples, blessed them with rituals that promised divine protection, and sent them into battle against Marduk's loyalists. The clash of mortals became the clash of gods, each city a pawn, each battlefield a board upon which ambition played. Blood flowed across plains, rivers turned red, and mankind realized that they were no longer merely servants of divine will. They had become its victims. The council convened again, though fewer attended. Enlil, older and weary, spoke of withdrawal, of abandoning Earth to its fate. "We came for gold," he said, "but we stayed for pride. Let us return to Nibiru before we destroy ourselves again." Enki disagreed. "We cannot leave now. We have shaped mankind too deeply. To depart would be to abandon our own reflection." The debate raged, but no resolution came. Marduk ignored them all, declaring that the age was his, and no council could change it. Thus the world stood on the edge once more, not from flood or fire, but from the ambitions of gods who could not let go. In the streets, mankind told stories that blended truth and legend, of a goddess who loved and destroyed, of a god who claimed the sun, of heroes who sought eternal life, of kings who spoke with heaven. These stories would become myths, and myths would become the bedrock of civilizations yet unborn. But beneath them lay a truth darker and more fragile, that the gods who shaped mankind were not eternal, not infallible, but flawed exiles whose quarrels scarred the earth. As the stars turned and the ram blazed high, Babylon stood radiant, its ziggurats glowing in the sun. Uruk plotted, Ur dreamed, Lagash prepared, and Aridu watched in silence. The storm of ambition had not passed. It had only shifted, waiting for its next strike. And in the hearts of men, both fear and hope grew, for they sensed that their fate was no longer just in the hands of gods. It was beginning, slowly, to rest in their own. The age of Marduk settled over the land like a cloak, heavy with inevitability, yet stitched with threads of resistance. Babylon rose higher, its ziggurats layered like steps toward the heavens, its streets alive with markets, temples, and the chants of priests proclaiming Ra as supreme. To the common people, Babylon appeared eternal, the navel of the world. To the Anunnaki, it was a monument to ambition, a reminder that one prince had bent destiny to his will. Yet within the walls of other cities, voices of dissent whispered in shadows, plotting to fracture the order Marduk proclaimed unshakable. Inanna was chief among the dissenters. She could not bear to see her rival enthroned as the master of earth. Her pride, wounded by the loss of Dumuzi and the denial of her own domain, sharpened into vengeance. In Uruk she gathered kings and captains, binding them with seduction and promises of conquest. She told them the age was not Marduk's alone, that the heavens favored those bold enough to seize fate. Warriors flocked to her banner, enchanted by her presence and emboldened by her vision of empire. Her city became a crucible where love and war burned together, producing armies that marched in her name. Marduk, hearing of her movements, hardened his resolve. He fortified Babylon, summoned his son Nabu to spread his word farther, and ordered temples built not just in Mesopotamia, but in lands beyond the rivers and seas. His cult reached the highlands, the deserts, even the coasts, weaving a web that rivaled the reach of the council itself. To his followers, he was no longer a god of one land, but of all lands. He declared himself Lord of Lords, the one who commands both heaven and earth, and his priests etched these titles into stone so that no rival could erase them. The council, such as it remained, grew increasingly fractured. Enlil, aged and weary, withdrew into silence, content to let destiny play itself out. Ninurta still polished his weapons, swearing he would rise if Babylon's dominance became unbearable. Nannar tended his moonlit temples, reluctant to intervene, but watchful. Utu guarded the sacred chariot place with discipline, his loyalty divided between kin and duty. Ninmah, heart-heavy, secluded herself in Tilmun, lamenting the endless cycles of destruction. And Enki, ever the dreamer, pondered the strange arc of events, wondering if this was the very fulfillment of the vision Galzu had given him. Mankind, in the midst of this celestial struggle, grew more restless. They had rebuilt from the flood, endured the poison winds, and survived the wars of gods. Their kings no longer saw themselves as mere servants, but as rulers in their own right, some claiming descent from gods, others boasting of victories won by human courage alone. They raised walls taller, fields wider, armies stronger. Trade spread across rivers and deserts, bringing distant lands into contact. Slowly, subtly, mankind was learning that survival and power could come from their own hands, not just from divine decrees. Yet they were still caught in the storm of rivalry. When Inanna marched, her armies were mortal, their blood spilled upon fields, their corpses left as offerings to her ambition. When Marduk retaliated, his soldiers were mortal too, crushed beneath his banners. For every temple razed, another was burned. For every city blessed, another was cursed. The gods quarreled, but it was mankind who paid the price. Stories of these wars spread, becoming myths of gods clashing in the skies, of heroes wielding divine weapons, of love and betrayal that shook the earth. In truth, they were echoes of ambition played out on human soil. Inanna struck first, leading her armies into lands loyal to Babylon. She moved with brilliance, her strategies sharp, her charisma irresistible. Victories came swiftly, and for a time it seemed she might bend destiny. But Marduk responded with relentless force. His son Nabu rallied tribes from the mountains, swelling his ranks with men eager for plunder and promise. They clashed on plains where rivers once nourished crops, now stained with blood. The battles were fierce, their outcomes uncertain, and the land groaned beneath the weight of ambition. The people began to question. Whispers spread that the gods who walked among them were not eternal, not infallible, but beings of flesh and flaw. They saw Enlil retreat into silence, Inanna consumed by vengeance, Marduk blinded by pride. They remembered the flood, the fire, the poison winds, and asked if these calamities were truly divine judgment or simply the quarrels of exiles who had made Earth their battlefield. These whispers were dangerous, for they suggested a future where mankind might chart its own course. Enki listened to these whispers with quiet interest. Walking among the people, he heard their songs and saw their inventions, pottery shaped with new skill, plows of stronger bronze, sails catching the wind upon rivers. He realized that even in the shadow of destruction, mankind's resilience grew. They were no longer only laborers or soldiers. They were thinkers, dreamers, creators. Perhaps, he mused, Gualzu's prophecy had been less about survival and more about this slow awakening, the rise of humans beyond the need for gods. But Marduk would not yield. He pressed his supremacy with fervor, declaring that any who opposed him opposed destiny itself. Inanna countered with equal passion, insisting that her star still burned and her time would come. The others, caught between them, hesitated, unwilling to unleash weapons again, but unable to restrain ambition. The balance wavered, and the earthlings braced themselves for another storm. Babylon grew richer, Uruk more defiant. Ur held steady under Nanar's silver gaze, while Lagash fortified its walls under Ninurta's shadow. Across the lands, kings played their roles, sometimes pawns, sometimes rebels, always struggling to balance divine favor with human survival. And through it all, the people endured, telling stories that turned gods into myths, battles into legends, and suffering into songs that could be carried through generations. The constellations turned overhead, marking the passage of ages. The ram gleamed brightly, confirming Marduk's claim, yet Venus still blazed, refusing to fade, reminding all that Inanna's star had not been extinguished. The heavens mirrored the earth, two lights vying for supremacy, neither willing to yield. And so the world waited, suspended between ambition and endurance, between the will of gods and the resilience of men. In the silence between battles, Enki stood in Aridu, gazing upon the rivers that had once nourished the first city. He felt both pride and sorrow, knowing the journey from Nibiru to Earth had brought salvation to one world, but endless conflict to another. He wondered if mankind would one day look back upon these ages not with reverence, but with pity, seeing the gods not as eternal, but as flawed exiles whose struggles carved both glory and ruin. And in that wondering, he glimpsed a truth he dared not speak aloud, that the future belonged not to the Anunnaki, but to mankind, who even now were learning to rise beyond the shadows of their makers. The rivalry between Marduk and Inanna hardened into something more than personal vengeance. It became the framework upon which the fate of whole nations hung. Babylon stood resplendent, its ziggurats climbing into the sky, its priests chanting hymns that declared Marduk the sole sovereign of earth and heaven. To oppose him was to oppose destiny itself, or so his prophets proclaimed. In Uruk, however, Inanna's fire still burned. Her temples were alive with music and war drums, her devotees convinced that her star would rise again, no matter how brightly Babylon shone. The tension between these two powers stretched across the land like a drawn bowstring, and the arrow was destiny itself, waiting to be released. Marduk moved to consolidate his supremacy by rewriting memory. He ordered that older tales of Enlil, Ninurta, and even Enki be diminished, their deeds recast as subordinate to his own. Scribes etched tablets that proclaimed him the savior of mankind, the one who had preserved Babylon when all else perished. He claimed credit for the flood's survival, the restoration of kingship, the very breath of life renewed after devastation. Nabu, his son, carried these stories across the lands, planting them like seeds in the minds of kings and peasants alike. Slowly, myths shifted, placing Marduk at the center, the sun around which all else revolved. Inanna, unwilling to surrender even her myths, fought with equal fervor. She inspired poets and singers to tell of her victories, of the lovers who adored her, of the wars she had waged and won. Her image spread on cylinder seals and figurines, a goddess both alluring and terrible, embodying love and battle in one form. She whispered to kings that their glory lay not in Babylon's shadow, but in daring to rise against it. Many believed her, though most paid with their lives when Marduk's armies swept through in retaliation. The people of Sumer, still recovering from the poisons unleashed in the weapons of terror, watched these struggles with exhaustion. Fields were replanted, but yields were meager. Irrigation canals filled again, but salt crept into the soil. The once fertile plain was slowly turning bitter, and many families abandoned their homes to seek better lands. Tribes migrated north and west, carrying with them not only memories, but also the knowledge taught by Enki and Ninmah, writing, farming, metallurgy. In this way, even as Sumer declined, civilization spread like ripples across rivers, reaching lands that had never known the presence of the Anunnaki. Enki observed this quiet diffusion with both pride and sorrow. He walked among wandering tribes, guiding them subtly, reminding them of the stars and the rhythms of the earth. To him it was clear, mankind was beginning to step beyond the gods. They no longer waited passively for decrees, but sought their own paths. He confided this thought to Ninmah in Tilmun, who nodded sadly. "Perhaps this was always the design," she said. "We gave them life, but life cannot remain bound. Children must one day walk without their parents' hands." Yet the gods clung to their dominions. Ninurta, though weary, fortified Lagash, raising monuments to his victories and hoarding weapons that reminded all he was still a force. Nannar kept Ur as a city of silver light, its ziggurat gleaming under the moon, though his influence waned as Babylon grew stronger. Ishkur retreated into the stormy highlands, his power confined, but his pride unbroken. Utu remained steadfast at the place of the chariots, guarding the pathway to Nibiru, though fewer skyships now came. Enlil himself grew increasingly distant, his voice seldom heard, his eyes clouded with the weariness of centuries. Meanwhile, Marduk turned outward, eyeing lands beyond Mesopotamia. His prophets declared that his rule was not meant for one region, but for the world. Nabu traveled to distant mountains and coasts, establishing shrines, teaching new tongues to chant his name. In Egypt, monuments were aligned to his star, and dynasties claimed his blessing. In the Levant, tribes invoked him as Baal, lord of storms and fertility. His reach was vast, and his ambition limitless, but each step forward deepened resentment, for the other gods saw in his expansion not destiny, but tyranny. It was Inanna who launched the boldest challenge. She sought to seize kingship in Kish, declaring that its throne should serve her, not Babylon. With her charm and cunning, she enthroned a king loyal to her, proclaiming him chosen by the star of Venus. Marduk responded with fury, sending armies to topple Kish. The clash was brutal, the city sacked, its people enslaved. Yet even in defeat, Inanna's defiance grew. She turned to Uruk once more, vowing that her star would never be extinguished. The humans caught in these storms began to question more openly. Why must their fields burn because of quarrels in heaven? Why must their sons die because gods could not share power? These questions grew louder, whispered in markets, sung in laments, etched in the hearts of survivors. The Anunnaki heard them and grew uneasy, for they sensed their grip loosening. Once, mankind saw them as gods beyond comprehension. Now, some began to see them as rulers flawed and fallible, beings who bled and quarreled like men. Still, devotion persisted, for fear and reverence run deep. Temples thrived, offerings poured in, rituals continued. But alongside them grew stories shaped by mankind itself, epics of heroes who defied gods, tales of mortals who outwitted destiny, songs of love and grief that belonged to human voices alone. These stories would one day form the foundation of civilizations far removed from Mesopotamia, but already their roots spread in the soil of disillusionment. Enki foresaw the danger. He warned the council that if they continued to wage war upon one another through mankind, they would lose the very reverence that sustained them. Already they build stories of themselves, he said, stories that do not need us. If we persist, we will become shadows, remembered not as lords but as warnings. Enlil dismissed him, too weary to argue, while Marduk laughed, declaring that memory itself was his to command. I will not be a shadow, he boasted. I will be the sun, eternal and unchallenged. The heavens turned slowly, marking the ages. The bull waned, the ram ascended, and the world seemed to affirm Marduk's claim. Yet Venus still glowed, refusing to fade, its brilliance reminding all that Inanna remained. Their rivalry was inscribed not only in temples and cities, but in the sky itself, where two lights vied for dominance. Mankind looked upward and saw a reflection of their world below: conflict, ambition, and endurance. And so the age of Marduk continued, not as a reign of peace, but as a storm of ambition cloaked in inevitability. Babylon stood strong, Uruk defiant, Ur steadfast, Lagash wary. The Anunnaki remained divided, their unity shattered beyond repair. Mankind grew restless, their resilience shaping them into something neither Enki nor Enlil could have foreseen. And in the quiet spaces between wars, in songs sung around fires and tablets etched with care, the first whispers of independence took form. The gods had written history with fire and flood, but mankind was beginning to write its own. The age of Marduk pressed forward, but beneath its surface the earth trembled with unrest. Babylon's temples rang with hymns, its ziggurats gleamed in the sun, and its priests proclaimed that destiny itself had crowned their god. Yet the more Marduk tightened his grip, the more mankind began to strain against it. They had endured floods, fire, and poisoned winds. They had rebuilt cities from mud and ruin, and with every calamity they had discovered that survival was possible by their own hands. Kings still knelt at divine altars, but in their hearts some had begun to believe that their thrones rested not only on the will of gods, but also on the loyalty of men. Marduk saw the shift and sought to counter it with fear and spectacle. Great processions filled the streets of Babylon, priests carrying golden statues, musicians playing flutes and drums, crowds chanting prayers that shook the very air. He decreed festivals that lasted weeks, binding the people with feasts and rituals. He demanded kings from surrounding lands bring tribute, bow before him in Exile, and proclaim him supreme. Those who refused faced his armies, led by Nabu's fervent followers. Some kings submitted, others resisted, but with every campaign Babylon's dominion widened. Yet the cost was high. Fields left untended for war grew barren, trade routes disrupted by marching armies withered, and famine crept into villages. In Ur, priests of Nannar whispered that Marduk's hunger for power was a curse upon the land. In Uruk, Inanna's devotees still raged, swearing her star had not been extinguished. Lagash, fortified by Ninurta's hand, stood defiant, its walls a bulwark against Babylon's reach. The land fractured, city against city, each invoking the name of its patron deity, but all caught in the undertow of a single rivalry. Among the Anunnaki, disillusionment deepened. Enlil, weary beyond words, withdrew almost entirely, his voice no longer guiding kings or councils. Ninurta, once fierce and loyal, grew embittered, watching his inheritance pass to Marduk without battle. Inanna burned with defiance, but her repeated defeats left her followers weary. Nannar clung to Ur, his influence waning with the decline of Sumer. Only Enki moved among them with quiet purpose, his gaze shifting from the quarrels of gods to the resilience of mankind. He traveled in secret, visiting tribes beyond Mesopotamia, teaching them crafts, agriculture, and astronomy. He guided them not with proclamations, but with whispers, planting seeds of knowledge that would outlast temples. He saw in their eyes a spark that had grown brighter with each trial. They no longer cowered before every thunderclap or famine. They endured, they adapted, they questioned. Enki began to wonder if Galzu's prophecy had not been about survival through catastrophe alone, but about this slow awakening, the moment when mankind would cease to need its makers. Marduk, sensing the shift but unwilling to admit it, doubled down. He commanded his scribes to inscribe his deeds upon clay, to rewrite history itself so that future generations would know no god but him. He claimed the flood as his doing, the preservation of life as his gift, the rebuilding of cities as his vision. His image was carved into statues, painted upon walls, woven into hymns. He sought to erase the memory of rivals, to make himself the axis upon which all time turned. But memory is not so easily bent. Inanna's star still glowed in the heavens, and her stories still spread, told in songs and whispers, keeping her defiance alive. In Uruk, she mounted one last desperate effort. She seduced a powerful king, lifting him to a throne with her blessing, declaring him chosen by her star. With his armies she marched against Babylon, hoping to strike before Marduk could gather his forces. The clash was fierce, filling plains with the thunder of chariots, the clash of bronze, the cries of men. But Marduk's armies were stronger, his followers more numerous, and once again Inanna was driven back. Her star dimmed not in the heavens, but in the hearts of her people, who grew weary of endless wars that brought only ruin. The people began to turn inward, focusing on their own survival rather than the rivalries of gods. They rebuilt homes, reopened trade routes, and sought alliances based not on divine favor, but on mutual need. In marketplaces, merchants spoke more of grain and silver than of temples. In villages, elders told stories not only of gods, but of ancestors who had endured and triumphed. Slowly, subtly, the center of power shifted. The gods still ruled, but mankind was beginning to live as though their rule was no longer absolute. This shift alarmed Marduk more than Inanna's defiance. He could crush armies, topple cities, silence priests, but he could not so easily command the quiet independence growing in human hearts. He sought new ways to bind them, new laws, new rituals, new promises of life after death. His priests elaborated ceremonies that promised kings eternal presence in his company, dynasties blessed forever. Tombs and temples rose across Egypt and Mesopotamia alike, monuments not only to rulers but to Marduk's claim that he alone could grant eternity. For a time, this satisfied, but the murmurs of doubt continued. Enki listened to those murmurs with guarded hope. He saw men recording their own histories, telling their own epics, inscribing clay with tales of heroes who challenged gods. He saw women weaving songs of love and grief that belonged to no temple but to the human heart. He saw children growing into a world where survival was not guaranteed by divine decree, but earned by human hands. He began to understand that the Anunnaki's age was waning, not with a sudden cataclysm, but with a slow erosion, like a river carving stone. Yet Marduk remained relentless. He could not accept decline, could not imagine a world in which he was not central. He pushed harder, demanded more, proclaimed louder, and in doing so, he unwittingly fueled the very independence he sought to suppress. For the more he insisted upon his supremacy, the more mankind began to ask, why must one god's quarrel dictate the fate of all? The ram still blazed in the sky, marking the age as his, but Venus refused to fade. The heavens themselves seemed to echo the struggle, two lights vying eternally. Babylon's ziggurats gleamed, Uruk's temples smoldered, Ur's silver glow endured, Lagash's walls stood firm. The gods still walked among men, but their shadows grew longer, their steps heavier, their voices less commanding. And so the balance shifted, almost imperceptibly, from divine to human. The Anunnaki had shaped mankind with clay and blood, had raised them with laws and wars, had nearly destroyed them with flood and fire. But now mankind began to shape itself, not in defiance alone, but in simple persistence. They built, they dreamed, they remembered. The gods still claimed supremacy, but in the silence of fields and the whispers of villages, a new truth was taking root, that the future might belong not to the lords of Nibiru, but to the children of Earth. The slow fading of the Anunnaki did not come as a sudden departure, but as a long twilight stretched across centuries. Babylon still stood tall, its ziggurats glowing under the sun, its priests proclaiming Marduk's supremacy. Yet the streets told a quieter story. Merchants haggled over copper and grain, craftsmen shaped bricks and pots, farmers tended fields with plows of their own making. The rituals continued, but behind them the pulse of human independence grew steadier. Temples might command reverence, but it was the hands of men and women that sustained daily life. Inanna's fire dimmed, though it never fully died. Uruk remained a city of beauty and song, but her armies no longer marched with the same fury. She had become as much a symbol as a ruler, a goddess whose stories inspired poets more than generals. Her devotees still filled her temples, whispering prayers to the morning star, yet their prayers were less about conquest and more about love, fertility, and fortune. In this transformation lay the beginning of myth. Inanna the conqueror became Inanna the lover, the goddess of passion and renewal. The people shaped her into what they needed, rather than the warrior she once had been. Enlil, who had once thundered with authority, now lingered in silence. His counsels no longer carried weight. His decrees no longer shook the earth. He withdrew to the highlands, his presence more memory than command. Ninurta, still strong, ruled Legish with iron discipline, but his wars grew smaller, confined to boundaries mankind could understand. Nannar kept Ur as a sacred city, yet his influence dwindled with each passing generation. Utu remained at the place of the chariots, guarding the path to Nibiru, though fewer ships came with each century. The connection to their home world weakened, and with it the purpose that had once bound them. Enki alone remained deeply engaged, though in his own quiet way. He no longer argued in councils or led armies. Instead, he walked among the people, teaching in whispers, guiding in shadows. He showed them how to irrigate dry lands, how to map the heavens, how to preserve knowledge in clay. He watched them adapt and innovate, creating tools and systems no god had given them. He realized that mankind had reached a point where their survival no longer depended on Anunnaki intervention. They had become resilient, inventive, capable of carrying their destiny forward. Marduk, however, could not let go. His pride demanded more, his hunger for supremacy insatiable. He ordered ever grander monuments, demanded ever greater tributes, proclaimed ever louder that he alone ruled heaven and earth. His son Nabu spread his word far and wide, carving it into stone, teaching kings to swear oaths in his father's name. For a time, this held, but the more he demanded, the more people whispered of his arrogance. They obeyed, but the reverence was hollow, the devotion strained. Behind the chants, doubts grew. Were these gods eternal, or were they rulers who had overstayed their welcome? Legends began to reshape the past. The flood became a story of divine judgment, the destruction of Sumer a tale of wrathful gods. Heroes like Gilgamesh became larger than life, their deeds embroidered with fantasy until they stood taller than the gods themselves. Inanna's love affairs became myths of passion. Marduk's wars became epics of cosmic struggle. Enki's wisdom became parables. Slowly, the Anunnaki themselves transformed from rulers of flesh into figures of myth. Their flaws softened or amplified depending on the needs of storytellers. The truth of exile, ambition, and rivalry faded, replaced by symbols that carried moral lessons rather than political memory. Mankind expanded into lands the Anunnaki scarcely touched. Tribes moved into the mountains, the deserts, the coasts. They carried with them fragments of memory, stories of skyships that flew like eagles, weapons that blazed like fire, gods who walked tall among men. In distant lands, these fragments became entire mythologies, reshaped to fit local landscapes. In the east, Ningishzida's teachings of stars and serpents became tales of feathered gods. In the west, Ninurta's storms became legends of thunderous deities. Across oceans, echoes of the Anunnaki lingered, but the names changed, the forms shifted, and the truth dissolved into myth. Within Mesopotamia, the rise of human dynasties signaled a deeper transformation. Kings began to claim divinity not by direct descent, but by right of conquest and achievement. Hammurabi would one day carve laws in stone, claiming inspiration from the gods, but the laws themselves bore the mark of human reason. Scribes filled tablets with stories, not only of divine decrees, but of contracts, trade, disputes, and poetry. The act of writing, once the tool of temples, became the tool of people. Knowledge, once hoarded, spread like seeds carried on the wind. Enki watched with quiet satisfaction. He saw his children surpass their makers, not in power, but in resilience. He whispered to Ninmah in Tilmun, "Perhaps this is what Galzu intended, that we be midwives, not masters. We gave them birth, but the future was never ours to command." Ninmah nodded, though sorrow clouded her gaze. "If so," she said, "then our time wanes. We must accept the shadows and let their light grow." But Marduk refused shadows. He raged at the spread of doubt, at the fading of reverence. He demanded that his priests strike down rival stories, that his statues be raised higher, that his name be etched into every stone. His voice grew louder as his influence quietly diminished, a king shouting to mask decline. His supremacy remained in Babylon, but beyond its walls his reach weakened. He could not stop the tide of human independence, though he could not yet see it fully. And so the twilight lengthened. The Anunnaki remained, but their presence was no longer the axis of life. Mankind built cities, raised armies, traded goods, wrote stories, and dreamed dreams that belonged to them alone. The gods still walked among them, but already they were becoming myths, distant, flawed, and larger than life. And mankind, still reverent but increasingly self-reliant, began to realize that their destiny might not lie in the hands of exiles from Nibiru, but in their own. The ram still blazed, Venus still shimmered, the heavens still mirrored the rivalry of gods. But in the fields and markets, in the songs and stories, a quiet revolution had begun. The Anunnaki had shaped the clay, but the clay had hardened into something they could no longer mold. The age of gods was waning, and the age of man was dawning. The twilight of the Anunnaki deepened, and though they still walked among cities, their presence carried more memory than command. Babylon remained Marduk's throne, its walls towering, its temples alive with hymns. But even there the devotion was tinged with weariness. The people gave offerings because it was expected, not always because they believed. In other cities the distance was clearer. In Ur, Nanner's priests carried out rituals beneath the silver light of the moon, but their power waned with each generation. In Uruk, Inanna's temple bustled with lovers and singers, yet her name was invoked more in poetry than in politics. In Lagash, Ninurta's warriors still trained, but their campaigns grew smaller, their battles more like human quarrels than cosmic wars. Marduk raged against this fading reverence. He ordered more statues raised, demanded more tributes, proclaimed louder than ever that the age of the ram was his alone. His son Nabu traveled ceaselessly, founding shrines, training priests, carving decrees. Yet the harder they pressed, the more mankind's independence solidified. Kings declared victories as their own, not merely as gifts from heaven. Scribes recorded trade agreements, contracts, and poetry that spoke more of human lives than divine decrees. Farmers relied on their own cycles of planting rather than waiting for omens. Priests still led rituals, but many people turned their faith inward, toward ancestors, toward the rhythms of Earth itself. Inanna, once a storm of ambition, grew more myth than monarch. Her stories spread far beyond Mesopotamia. Songs of her descent into the underworld, of her lovers won and lost, of her triumphs and betrayals. These tales, reshaped in the mouths of storytellers, became lessons about love and mortality rather than records of divine politics. She was no longer the rival of Marduk, so much as the symbol of desire and renewal. In this transformation she gained a strange immortality, for while her power in councils faded, her name endured in the imaginations of mankind. Enlil, retreating into the highlands, faded almost completely. His voice, once law, was heard only rarely, a distant echo of thunder. Ninurta guarded his strongholds, but his campaigns ceased. Nanar's influence narrowed to Ur alone. Ishkur's storms shook mountains, but few heeded his name. Utu still watched the skies from the sacred place, but his duties became more symbolic than real, for skyships from Nibiru grew fewer, until at last they ceased altogether. The bond between Earth and their home world, once the lifeline of their mission, had frayed to nothing. The Anunnaki were stranded, not by exile, but by the turning of ages. Enki alone seemed to accept this twilight with calm. He walked along the rivers, spoke with scribes, guided builders, and taught healers. He no longer declared himself Lord, but lived among mankind as a wise teacher, his words woven into their traditions. Some called him Ea, the god of water and wisdom. Others remembered him as a sage who taught them how to write, how to count, how to heal. He did not resist this transformation into myth. He embraced it, knowing that in myth he would live longer than in flesh. He told Ninmah in Tilmun, "Perhaps this is our true immortality, not as rulers, but as stories." Ninmah, tired and sorrowful, agreed. But Marduk could not surrender. His pride demanded eternity in flesh, not just in story. He commanded ever greater monuments, seeking to inscribe his supremacy into stone. He sought to erase rivals from memory, to rewrite every tale so that his was the only name remembered. Yet even as he built, mankind began to record their own histories. Kings claimed lineage from mortals, dynasties justified their rule with conquests, and scribes wrote epics of heroes who defied the gods. Gilgamesh, long dead, lived larger in human memory than Marduk's armies did in their own time. This shift enraged Marduk, but he could not stop it. The people still honored him, but not with the fervor he craved. They came to temples out of duty, not devotion. They spoke his name in prayers, but lived their lives with growing confidence in themselves. They traded across deserts, sailed across seas, built alliances, and waged wars that had little to do with the decrees of gods. Civilization spread beyond Mesopotamia, into valleys of the Indus, across the Nile, into lands that would one day be Greece and beyond. The Anunnaki's influence thinned with each new frontier, until they were no longer rulers of the world, but guardians of shrinking domains. And so the great arc of their story bent toward an ending. They had come as exiles from a dying world, seeking gold to save their skies. They had forged cities, raised kings, unleashed floods and fire. They had created mankind, first as workers, then as heirs. They had warred among themselves, scarred the land, and crowned new rulers. But now their time waned, not by decree, not by sudden disaster, but by the quiet endurance of mankind. The clay they had shaped had hardened into something they could no longer mold. Mankind still remembered them, still honored them, but increasingly as symbols, as myths, as stories. The gods became archetypes of love, of war, of wisdom, of the sun and moon. Their flaws were forgotten or exaggerated, their deeds retold in poetry. The truth of ambition, rivalry, and exile faded into legend. And in that fading, the Anunnaki achieved the immortality they had sought, though not as lords, but as myths carried by human memory. Babylon remained, but even Babylon could not hold forever. Empires would rise and fall, kings would conquer and die, and Marduk's name would join the chorus of ancient gods. Yet in the songs and stories, the essence of the Anunnaki endured, transformed by human voices into something greater than rule, into meaning. The heavens still turned, the ram still blazed, Venus still shimmered, the moon still cast its silver glow. But on Earth, mankind had begun to write its own story, not as clay shaped by gods, but as hands shaping their own destiny. The age of gods had not ended in one moment of fire or flood. It ended in silence, in the steady footsteps of men and women walking forward, carrying memory, shaping myth, and creating the future. The fading of the Anunnaki was not marked by a single departure, but by a slow unraveling. One by one, their voices fell silent, their temples grew quiet, their images turned from presence into memory. Babylon still echoed with Marduk's proclamations, its walls bristling with pride, its priests chanting hymns that declared him eternal. But outside those walls, time was working a quiet rebellion. New kings rose and fell, not because of divine decrees, but because of human ambition. Armies marched for territory, merchants traveled for trade, farmers sowed and reaped for survival. The gods still loomed in the imagination, but the pulse of daily life belonged increasingly to mankind. Inanna's brilliance had softened into legend. The young no longer remembered her as the fiery goddess who raised armies and waged wars. They remembered instead the tales of her loves, her descent into the underworld, her power to inspire passion and despair. In songs sung at weddings and laments chanted at funerals, her name lingered, but as myth rather than command. Uruk's temples remained, but her armies no longer filled the plains. Her star still shone in the evening sky, but for mankind it was a beacon of beauty, not a call to war. Nanar's silver light still bathed Ur, but the city itself was faltering. Salt choked its fields, rivers shifted their course, trade dwindled. His priests clung to rituals, yet the people looked more to their kings than to the moon. Ninurta's Lagash remained fortified, but his power was more ceremonial than real. Ishkur thundered in the mountains, yet his storms were explained by men who studied weather and cycles. Even Utu at the chariot place became more a symbol than a sentinel, for no ships came from Nibiru, no messengers crossed the void. The bond between Earth and their home world had snapped, leaving the Anunnaki marooned in memory. Enlil withdrew completely, vanishing into obscurity. Once the voice of order, he had become a shadow. His thunder was remembered in myths of a sky god, stern and demanding, but he no longer walked among men. Ninmah, weary of sorrow, tended her sanctuary in Tilmun until her name too faded into legend. Enki alone remained, but even he accepted the Twilight. He no longer declared decrees or commanded followers. Instead, he became the wise old sage in countless tales, the god of water, the bringer of knowledge, the one who warned mankind of the flood. His presence endured not through power, but through memory, through stories carried from one generation to the next. Marduk raged against this decline. He demanded new monuments, new temples, new proclamations. His son Nabu wrote tirelessly, carving his father's supremacy into stone, spreading his cult into distant lands. For a time it seemed to work, as empires beyond Mesopotamia embraced him under different names. In Egypt, he was Ra. In Canaan, Baal. In other lands, simply the Great Lord. But even as his name spread, its meaning shifted, molded by human tongues and traditions. He became less a living ruler and more a symbol, absorbed into myths that no longer matched the flesh and blood exile who once fought in the councils. The people remembered the flood, but not as it had been. They remembered fire from the skies, but not the weapons of terror. They remembered gods who shaped clay into man, but not the long years of toil in mines. Truth had become myth, and myth had become heritage. The Anunnaki themselves, if they still walked the earth, were no longer recognized as rulers, but mistaken for kings, sages, or wanderers. Their twilight had become their immortality, not in thrones, but in the stories mankind carried. Civilization spread far beyond the cradle of Sumer. The Indus Valley blossomed with cities and scripts of its own. Along the Nile, dynasties rose, building monuments aligned with stars, echoing the teachings of the old gods, but carried forward by human hands. In the highlands of Anatolia and the shores of the Mediterranean, tribes built walls and temples, invoking gods whose names only faintly resembled those of Nibiru. Across oceans, whispers of feathered serpents and storm lords echoed Ningish Zida and Ishkur, carried in fragments of memory across generations. The Anunnaki had become seeds scattered by time, sprouting into myths across the world. Enki saw this and understood. He spoke to Ninmah in his final days, saying, "We sought to rule, but we were only guides. Our pride blinded us, our quarrels scarred this world, yet they endured. The children of earth have become their own masters. We will be remembered not as we were, but as they need us to be." Ninmah, her eyes heavy with sorrow and pride, replied, "Perhaps that is what immortality truly is, to live not in flesh, but in story." The heavens continued to turn. The ram still blazed, Venus still shimmered, the moon still glowed. But mankind looked upward with new eyes. They charted constellations, measured eclipses, mapped the paths of stars, not as omens of gods, but as patterns of nature. What had once been divine decrees became science. What had once been fear became understanding. The Anunnaki had taught them to look upward, but now they looked without waiting for commands. They searched the heavens not for gods, but for knowledge. Marduk remained in Babylon until the end of his days, clinging to his throne, proclaiming his supremacy. His followers recorded his deeds, his priests sang his hymns, but time moved on. Empires shifted, dynasties fell, and Babylon itself would one day be conquered. His name, once shouted in the streets, would fade into the echoes of ancient texts. Yet in myth he endured, reshaped into figures worshipped under many names, his ambition immortalized not as history, but as legend. Thus the twilight became night. The Anunnaki were no longer rulers, no longer lords of earth. They were remembered in clay, in song, in myth, scattered across cultures and centuries. Their true story, the exile from Nibiru, the quarrels of brothers, the wars of ambition, was buried beneath layers of legend. But in that burial lay their immortality, for mankind would never forget the idea of them, even if their reality was lost. And mankind, once clay molded by foreign hands, now shaped itself. They built empires, wrote laws, composed epics, charted stars, and dreamed of futures the gods had never imagined. They carried forward the memory of divine wars, but they carried also the lesson that survival belongs not to those who rule from thrones, but to those who endure in fields, in markets, in homes. The gods had faded, but mankind had risen, and the story was now theirs to tell. The final act of the Anunnaki upon Earth was not a battle or a decree, but a silence. The voices that once thundered across councils, that once commanded armies and raised cities, faded into whispers. Babylon still held its splendor, its ziggurats gleaming like stairways to the sky, but even there the air had changed. Marduk remained enthroned, his priests chanting hymns that proclaimed him eternal, yet time itself no longer obeyed him. Seasons passed, dynasties shifted, and mankind's story began to move without waiting for the steps of gods. In Uruk, Inanna's temples remained filled with singers and dancers, but her fire had cooled. She was remembered less as the goddess of conquest and more as the star of passion, the bringer of fertility and desire. Her tales, once chronicles of war and vengeance, were retold as myths of love, of descent into darkness and return to light. Inanna, the warrior, faded. Inanna, the lover, endured. In this way she achieved the immortality she had always sought, though not through the throne of a kingdom, but through the breath of story. In Ur, Nanar's moonlit temple still glowed, but its rituals had become traditions rather than commands. In Lagash, Ninurta's fortresses stood like bones of an older age, relics of a time when gods led armies. Ishkur's storms were still feared in the mountains, but they were seen as weather, not as wrath. Utu's gaze still followed the stars, but no chariot descended from the heavens. The link to Nibiru had snapped, and with it the purpose that had once bound them all. Enlil, who had once been the voice of order, disappeared entirely from human sight. His thunder remained only in the stories of sky gods, stern and demanding, distant and unyielding. Ninmah tended her sanctuary until her final days, her name remembered as a healer, a mother, a goddess of compassion. And Enki, wise, patient Enki, walked quietly among the people until at last he too was remembered not as a lord, but as a sage, the god of water, of wisdom, of secrets. His gift to mankind was not dominion, but knowledge, and knowledge endured. Marduk alone resisted the twilight. He shouted louder as the world grew quieter, demanded more as mankind gave less. He ordered monuments, raised armies, proclaimed that the age was his forever. But history moved on. Babylon fell to conquerors, empires rose and fell, kings came and went, and though his name endured in hymns and temples, it became one among many. He became Baal in one land, Ra in another, Zeus in yet another, his identity reshaped by the tongues of men. In this transformation, he achieved a strange triumph. He was remembered everywhere, but no longer as himself. And so the Anunnaki passed into memory. The flood became myth, a story of divine judgment. The weapons of terror became tales of fire from heaven. The creation of mankind became a parable of clay and breath, shaped by divine hands. Gilgamesh's quest became an epic of mortality, Inanna's descent a tale of renewal, Marduk's battles a legend of cosmic struggle. Truth and memory blurred until only myth remained. The Anunnaki, once flesh and blood, became archetypes, symbols of power, love, wisdom, and pride. But mankind endured. They built empires from Mesopotamia to the Nile, from the Indus to the Mediterranean. They carved laws in stone, wrote poems in clay, charted stars, and measured time. They crossed deserts and seas, planted seeds in foreign soils, and dreamed of worlds beyond their own. They remembered the gods, yes, but they no longer depended upon them. They prayed, they sang, they built temples, but they also farmed, traded, governed, and created by their own will. The clay had hardened, the child had grown. Enki's quiet prophecy came true. Mankind had become the inheritor of Earth. Not perfect, not free of folly, but resilient, capable of rising after every fall. The Anunnaki had given them life, but in return, mankind had given them immortality, not in flesh, but in memory, not in thrones, but in stories, and stories last longer than stone. The heavens still turned, constellations tracing their eternal paths. The ram blazed in its age. Venus shimmered as a bright evening star. The moon waxed and waned. The sun rose and set. Mankind looked upward, as they always had, but now with eyes of their own. They measured the stars not as omens of gods, but as guides for navigation, as patterns of cycles, as mysteries to be solved. The gods had taught them to look to the heavens, but it was mankind who would one day reach for them. Thus ended the age of the Anunnaki, not with a final decree, but with the quiet dawn of human history. Their temples crumbled, their names shifted, their presence faded, but their echoes remained. In myths and legends, in stone and song, they lived on. And mankind, walking forward into the unknown, carried their memory like a shadow, sometimes feared, sometimes revered, always remembered. The gods had come seeking survival, had found ambition, had unleashed destruction, had crowned themselves rulers. But in the end, it was mankind who survived them all. The clay had risen, the story had shifted, and the future belonged not to the exiles of Nibiru, but to the children of Earth. And so, the saga closes. The Anunnaki became myths, the myths became heritage, and heritage became history. Their footsteps echo still in temples, in ruins, in constellations, but their voices are silent. What remains is the story, a story of gods who came from the stars, who shaped mankind, who ruled and quarreled, and who faded into legend. The story now belongs to us,